Bada bing, bada boom. All right, we are live, ladies and gentlemen. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Authoritarian to Different Ends, Part 3. I haven't figured out a witty title for this one yet, but hopefully that'll come to me by the end of the stream. Here with me again are the two folks you will remember from last time, those being Ray and Enver, but joining us again is a holdover from Part 1, Nero, and another centrist that he sort of brought with him, that is the Natsec wonk. So everybody knows Ray and Enver, so Nero and Natsec, if you guys want to share a little bit about yourselves.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me here. I am Nero. As you know, I'm a centrist. I'm right-wing when it comes to things like foreign policy, general economics, law enforcement, but I'm on the left when it comes to things like universal health care, reproductive choice, etc. I just mostly stick to the empirical data and see how which policies would result in the best outcomes for the most Americans possible, if that makes sense.
And what about you, Natsec?
I mostly just focus on, national security matters. My background has been formerly in biomedicine, but I do aim to go into national security studies at Georgetown one day. But for the most part, anything on national security matters, I am the dude to come to. And that's about it.
Alrighty then.
And I have a YouTube channel, so.
Okay, yeah. Well, I've linked your Twitter below, but I can change that afterwards if you'd like.
That's fine. Thank you, though.
No worries, no worries. All right, so to kick this one off, we're going to start with the topic that me and Ray were getting into at the end of Part 1, but we didn't actually end up touching at all in Part 2, and that is it's kind of a continuation of the abortion topic, and more so in regards to contraception, because that's what we really didn't get to discussing, and that's what seemed to confound you the most. Before we get to that specifically, though, there is on the issue of foreign rape and not wanting to raise a child who was conceived in rape and things like that, because it's the enemy essentially, and it's the enemy's child really in terms of their foreign policy. I was sent an interesting DM some time ago about what could be done with foreign-born children, so to speak, who are, if you don't want them integrating in society, what could you do with them? The half-blood, so to speak. And let me just find it. Here we go. It was sent up in the chat, but I guess we missed it at the time. And it goes along the lines of just have the military take undesirable kids and raise them to be loyal super soldiers of the state, and sort of essentially making them some sort of Spartan-like program where kids who kids who just are brought into this world in undesirable circumstances and are of the enemy are now just tools of the state, kind of, and they can be used for like a net good.
That went really badly for the last group of people who did that. What were they called again? I think they were called the Mamelukes, and something happened where they ended up being in control of the entire society when it was finished.
I actually have no clue what you're talking about, so please expand on that.
Okay, well, I mean, unless anyone wants to correct me, I'm pretty sure that a bunch of Arab tribes attempted this idea which you just described, when they essentially kidnapped a bunch of children from the Caucasus and brought them into the Middle East, and then made them into, quote, super soldiers, and then the super soldiers took over the entire place.
Okay, I've never actually heard of that before.
Wasn't that what the Mameluke uprising was? Where they had a coup, and then everyone ended up having to actually bow down to them? Pretty sure that's how it went. Someone correct me if I'm wrong, because maybe I'm just reading my own interpretation into this.
No, I just have no clue of. I've never heard of I'm not huge into the Middle Eastern history, and so I've just never heard of that event to begin with. But it sounds not unbelievable, especially if you're taking into account it's kidnapped children. Although I think the distinction somewhat here is that it's children who are at least half your blood, but who just happen to be also half of, quote unquote, the enemy's blood as well. And so it's not like they're not of that nation entirely. It's more so that they're just not fully of that nation. So they still have some loyalties to it, I suppose. And it's not like it's complete foreigners either, if they were to assume control.
And also in Ray's case,
I'm saying that there's an antagonistic relationship, even though that relationship is slightly different between the two comparisons. Because in one comparison, the group of people went out and engaged in kidnapping and abductions, which caused the scenario to unfold. Whereas in the scenario you described from last time, it's people coming in from outside, committing crimes that result in people getting pregnant against their will, and then the antagonism of you demanding that those children should be brought to term regardless of that fact. Sorry, those fetuses should be brought to term regardless of that fact, apparently.
Now
So
you get
it's
it right
still
the first time.
yeah, so it's still an antagonism. It's just a slightly different kind of it. So why would it end up some other way?
Well, it's a different antagonism, and I'd argue it's much less of an antagonism because, again, it's these kids are still half of your nation, so it's not like they're completely unloyal. And on top of that, it's if they're being raised in the culture from society, it's not like I like people like the alt-type, and I like their sort of genetic determinism to a certain extent, but, that's just it, to a certain extent. I don't think that just because this kid is part of another nation genetically, that if he isn't, raised in this tradition strictly, and he isn't raised hailing from more his mother's side, I don't think it's impossible for him to accept that nation as his homeland and for him to be a valuable asset.
No, but you're papering this over as though this stuff was consensual. I'm talking about the fact that this sequence of events was non-consensual. That's the key component. Not necessarily that their blood is such and such, but rather that plus the fact that it's all non-consensual.
If you take
why would that end well?
When you look at the group as like you're saying that the reason that the allegiances might be consequences because of the genetics, but that's really ridiculous when you consider this group is being like they're already as a group being alienated from the society that they're supposed to be integrated in through this like program that you call this like you bring up the comparison to Spartans, but the only reason like the Spartans thing kind of worked is that they were like the children from the tribe who were done this, and they were specifically done as to oppress the immediate people around them. Who they literally had a city right next to Sparta that was the designated slave city, an entire community that they just got that they took the surplus of to use to support the city of Sparta. I don't see how you could really make that work. Even this isn't the thing about like genetic determinism. This is the system you're setting up for these kind of people is one that is ripe for alienation, resentment, and I think antagonism.
That's a fair point. And again, this is just an interesting thought that I was sent, and I want to mention it because, again, we kind of come to the conclusion last time that for me, it's much less an issue of, secular ends or secular means to an end as much in it, like a human life is an end in itself. And I'm not fully endorsing this. I just thought it would be interesting to hear what you guys had to say about it because, again, a human life is a human life. I don't care how it's conceived. I don't care what might the possible results be. It's a human life, and it has dignity as such.
Well, in context, the person's idea being described, if you were to apply that to like 2018, for example, that would be like claiming that after everything that's happened in Germany since 2013, that Angela Merkel should, for some reason, outlaw abortion and contraception, and then deliberately cultivate the non-consensual half Arab, half German children of non-consensual unions to be some kind of German super soldiers that are supposed to patrol the border that they themselves violated in the first place.
Well, hold on now. The children didn't violate didn't violate their borders. Their fathers did. So it's again the children have committed no crime in this. They are completely innocent parties.
No, but okay, hold on. It seems strange to me as well that basically the blood-based argument is invoked for when you want to claim that these children would be somehow part of the German nation. But then at the same time, if I invoke that exact same thing to say that they're not part of the German nation, then suddenly blood doesn't matter anymore.
No. It's not that they're not a part of the German nation. I'm just saying their crimes aren't passed down. The children don't absorb the crimes of their fathers.
Okay, so your argument is that they absorb the nationality of their mother, but not the crime of their father?
Yes, because crime is an action. Nationality and ethnicity is just genes. Like they're going to be half of their nationality of their father, half of the nationality of their mother. And if they're raised under the culture of their mother...
But they are literally the product of a crime.
Okay, but they did not commit that crime, so why should they be found guilty of it? Like,
Okay,
why should they be?
would you not say their very
Who is saying we
existence
should
is a
treat
crime?
fetuses like criminals? I don't think Ray is saying that at all.
Well, it's just
Yeah, I'm saying it's more the existence of that fetus was a crime in the first place.
Well, no, the existence of the fetus wasn't the crime. The act that made the fetus is the crime. That act that made that child was the crime.
These things seem to be precisely linked, though. It'd be almost like saying
You
the
know,
fire.
isn't your
Hold on,
position
hold on.
Sorry.
It'd be like saying the fire in the building is not a crime, but the lighter which was thrown on the floor deliberately by an arsonist was the crime.
Yes, and that's
These two things. No, these two things are completely linked because the fire would not be engulfing the building if someone didn't set it on fire.
Pragmatic.
Yeah,
As a Catholic, don't you believe that life begins at conception?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, then it doesn't seem to be represented in the argument you're giving there.
How do you mean?
If the act, presumably, that is being in question here is the act of conception, isn't it?
No, the act is the act of rape, not the conception of the child itself, but the force of the action that would eventually lead to the conception. Because not all sex leads to conception either. Like, you'd punish a rapist regardless of whether or not there was a child involved in what happened. And, most of the time it's worth noting that there isn't. But, just because there is a child in one instance doesn't mean that, you should take that child's life via abortion just because it was conceived in an ugly and disgusting manner.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
Sure.
Okay, if I move the goalpost slightly, is that I'm moving it not forward but rather backward, because the last thing that we closed on was the issue of birth control. If by your logic, there's this whole business of, you're not allowed to do that under your religion because of the fact that you believe that the life begins at the conception for some reason. Okay, so let's not deal with that for a second, and let's go further back than that. Why can't the person use birth control, in your opinion?
Okay, yes. This is an entirely different argument than abortion, because this comes down to less a matter of the sanctity and life of stuff, because you're right, it's not a life at that point. It's just the process. It's just a sperm and an egg, essentially. That's not life, obviously. It hasn't formed a zygote. And so what this is it's funny because a fellow on Twitter by the name of Classical Theist actually discussed this with Shannon Q on, I believe, Godless Cranium's channel at some point. And I never heard the argument made that before, and up until I had, I really wouldn't be able to articulate it well. But it has to do with the nature of sexual reproduction and stuff, and the nature of human beings. And so, as female humans, it comes down to, every so often you have the egg. You either make it a baby or you don't. It gets flushed out of your system, and so the cycle continues month after month. But
by the same logic, I know you're going to go to the naturalistic argument here, but by the same logic, race bias also correlates with the cycle as well, meaning that by your own logic then, it means that I need to become more racist at a certain time of month?
I don't think...
resist it? There's just no reason to not do that, because naturally speaking, that's what's supposed to happen?
I don't think... Yes, obviously, there's some intensified in-group preference at that point because you're worried about protecting a potential offspring. And no, I wouldn't say that's a bad thing. It's not that you have to become.
Okay, so then, if you say it is not a bad thing that this in-group preference happens around that exact time that you were talking about, then why would you say that it's a bad thing for the person to act on that in-group preference through the use of the exact same technologies that you're now saying that people should not use?
Hold on, reformulate that for me. I didn't get what you were saying.
You just told me that it's okay if you have an enhanced in-group preference at a particular time in every 28-day cycle, but at the same time, the guardian of that in-group preference, which is the use of technologies such as birth control, for example, you're saying people should not use these despite that fact?
No, because birth control actually ends up distorting that intensified in-group preference because it prevents you from going through that cycle every 28 days. That's the point of it. And so I would tell you It's actually not intensifying that.
No, rather than going through the cycle, no, rather than going through that cycle every 28 days, it just gets jammed in that position consistently, meaning that the person is consistently in that position now. So it doesn't make them any less. It doesn't make them any less racist. If we're following this logic to its logical conclusion, it just makes them in fact more racist more consistently.
Just as a point of clarification, are we only talking about the pill here, or other kinds of contraception?
Only the pill at the moment.
Okay. Yeah, but we can talk about others. I'm not quite getting what you're saying birth control does in this situation, because it sounds like you're saying birth control.
Yeah,
it sounds like you're. Sorry, go ahead.
As far as I understand, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, because obviously I'm STEM and not on the other side, right? But I'm pretty sure that birth control actually switches stuff so that your body is deceived into thinking that you're at the it deceives your body into thinking that you're almost pregnant, but all the time. I'm pretty sure that's what it does, right?
I can't say. I've actually not looked into that science, but
am I right?
Let's say you're right. We can say you're right. So you're saying, why is it bad to be in that constant state then?
Yes. Why would you argue that it's bad to be in that constant state?
Because that state's only meant for a certain period of time when you're actually going through it. It's not meant to be something that you're jammed in 24/7 just so that you don't actually end up conceiving a child. It's something that's only supposed to be occasional because, having a child isn't a 24/7.
Well, to take that
what about the responsibility? Oh, no, go on. Actually, Andrew, go on.
Yeah, to take the naturalistic argument to like another kind of medicine, shall we say, you're only really supposed to develop an immune response to diseases when you actually get that disease. But we developed vaccines to do that earlier so that when we actually come in contact with those diseases, we do not get sick. I don't really see how that's
but there's no natural cycle to getting a disease at some point in time.
For some diseases, there is.
Every now and again you can get a seasonal flu, but that's not a part of the human process. Like, diseases are external things. They are external to the human body that we just happen to come in contact with. What is it? I'm sorry, go on, give your example.
Well, there is examples of like autoimmune disease and other kinds of cancers, and some cancers can actually be treated with vaccines, mind you, for the same sometimes the same reason that they prevent you from getting other diseases in the first place.
Also, another one that I will add on to this as well is that by your own logic, you'd be saying that all women should make sure not to avoid osteoporosis on purpose.
Okay, hold on. Diseases in general, I should make this clarification, are not the norm. Diseases are an aberration from normal human fitness and well-being, which is what God desires for us. And so to help keep your body, your temple of the Holy Spirit, in as best possible condition, it's okay to take whatever measures necessary because you're combating something that's inherently abhorrent and against our nature in the first place.
Well, aging is a normal human process, but you can slow it down by like staying in a cold environment artificially for a long time. Is that does the same clause apply there?
Are you talking about like, is it wrong to like put yourself into a sort of cryogenic sleep to?
Well, not like, I don't mean like cryogenic. I just mean like if you constantly live at a slightly colder temperature than what most people consider normal, you can extend your lifespan by quite a number of years.
Yeah, but there's normal and natural, and it's perfectly natural for people to live long lives or to want to live long lives. Like, that isn't something necessarily new. And if you go about doing that in some odd ways, that's not against nature. You're just sort of extending the natural process in that sense. Like, things that are...
I mean, by your own logic, you can always use the nature argument for anything. For instance, I can use the nature argument to fully support what I'm talking about, which is basically blocking, since women are the deciders and the ones who are the gatekeepers of reproduction, apparently, right? Because nature has designated this to be so, then why should we not use any technology which is available to us in order to carry out that function?
Because
or to put it more crudely, which I'm sure in a way that the audience might laugh at a bit, basically, if your function is to go around cock blocking on a consistent basis, then why would you not use every single tool available to accomplish that task?
because there's natural. Well, just because you're the gatekeepers of humanity doesn't mean you can go about making that decision in any way. There are natural ways to be the gatekeepers of humanity, and there are unnatural ways, or unnatural ways, I should say, to go about doing it.
Okay,
And
well then we end up with a weird argument of basically what are the natural ways to avoid rape, for example.
sure, I'd say one of those is. I mean, I'm fine having that discussion too if you want.
Because I mean that's where we end up, right? Because you're saying that the unnatural way to avoid rape is to take birth control. The unnatural way to mitigate rape after it has occurred is to use abortion. And what is the natural way then? To shoot someone with a gun then, right? I guess. Let's say that gun rights are allowed in
Yeah.
to stab the person or to kill them. But if you're unable to... Yeah,
self-defense is perfectly okay.
Okay, but if you know that there's a reasonable percentage chance that some percentage of the population will be incapable of satisfying this, then you're basically saying that, okay, everyone who is incapable in every scenario of defending themselves adequately should then actually follow through with essentially creating rape fetuses. That's your position.
Yes, I believe they should bring a human life to term because, I mean, no matter how it's conceived, it is a human life and it has a certain objective worth beyond how it was brought into this earth.
Okay, I'm going to make another slight joke here since this is one of those times when jokes are necessary. So, okay, you know how people often say on Twitter, read a different book whenever you invoke the Harry Potter franchise? Yeah, I'm going to do it right now anyway.
Not to read Aquinas?
No. I'm going to say that I'm going to be told to say read a different book. The impression I get here is that we're almost approaching these things from completely opposite values, right? So it's almost like
I believe we are.
Yes. So I think that if we were in the quote Harry Potter universe or something, it'd be almost like you're approaching this stuff from the position of like a Hufflepuff or something, and I'm not ironically playing this as a Slytherin.
I mean, I wouldn't. Again, it's black and white. We're here having the discussion because I think discussing these things is fun, and obviously, I don't think you're Slytherin. But I mean,
but logically speaking, that is the only thing that would be matched to in that context, right?
I have a theological question, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Where do the dead fetuses go? Do they go to heaven, or are they in purgatory, which got like nixed, or they go to hell?
No, you're the second person to tell me that they thought purgatory got nixed, and I don't know where this is coming from, but it is not true.
The Pope released a patch on hell, on purgatory.
Which Pope and which edict was this? Because
I can't remember, man. I have to look it up.
No, because I mean, popes can change things sometimes if they really think it's in line with doctrine, but I have not heard. I do not know which doctrine or which pope this was. And every time I'm asked, people say they don't know. But it's like I went to a Catholic high school, and we were still taught the doctrine of purgatory. So as far as I'm aware, my high school teachers were up to date on their Catholic teaching, and I just find it odd that they would teach me something that's no longer supposedly in the canon. But to answer your initial question, which was, do they go to heaven or hell? The Catholic teaching is now, because it wasn't in the past, that they would indeed go to heaven, because the thinking is, even though they do
they haven't been baptized.
You're right. No, they haven't been baptized, but they're also not guilty of any other crimes. And the thinking behind it is that God's mercy and love are so vast that God would see these children as innocent, even though they still have original sin technically, and would allow them to enter the kingdom anyway.
I found the article on the thing. It was Pope Benedict, and 16? It was a 41. Yeah, the one in 2007. The 41-page report by the Vatican's Theological Commission said this in 2007.
Interesting. I'd have to check about, maybe it's not, there could be the possibility that it's his. There are certain requirements that a pope has to meet before his statement actually becomes infallible and a part of church doctrine. It has to be ex cathedra, it has to be X, Y, and Z. So if it might not have met all those requirements, and hence it might not be official church canon, but I'll have to look into that more for sure.
Can I say something very quickly that's sort of unrelated? But is Natsik still in here? Because he's not showing up on my end.
No, he left.
Okay.
He said he'd be back.
Yes.
Okay.
He said he shall return, so we await him. But is there anything else you guys want to cover on contraception, abortion, and whatnot?
I did have one question for Ray that will.
Yeah, I've got
that
another
spurred
question
my
as well.
Yeah, Ray. I know we discussed this last night in our prep call, and I have a question. See, we know how psychologically the psychological damage that's imposed on a woman who is raped, right? So, do we know anything about the psychological damage caused by forcing a woman to give birth to a child she does not want? Do we know
Yeah, of
anything
course.
about?
Yeah, of course we know. I don't have the figures to hand, but I mean, this has been covered a million times over in various countries in Africa during those wars, like the ones between the war in Eritrea, for example, and there was the other one, the one in the Congo. Well, the one in the Congo, it goes on indefinitely, it would appear. So, I mean, does anyone look at those societies and think to yourself, oh yeah, that looks like a really healthy situation they've got there?
So what you're saying
No,
is
obviously
that,
it isn't, so I don't understand, like, why that's even a thing.
no, my question is though is that does the psychological consequences of forced births is it comparable to the psychological consequences of rape in any way, shape, or form?
Yes, I would assume so, given that the person is essentially just reliving the fact of the problem and is being essentially made to reconcile with that thing indefinitely and forever. First off, and secondly, it just means that that shame is then continuing to hang over that person's head indefinitely and forever. And what else would you have? Oh yes, you'd have a lower trust society as a consequence, because you literally can't build society on that. Which is obviously why originally people outlawed rape in the first place, because you wouldn't be able to have a society.
So pragmatic, I have a question for you.
Yes.
Wait. So,
Okay.
if you can logically argue that rapists should be punished for all the shit they have done to people, then can it be argued, based on what Ray just said, that forcing a woman to give birth to a child she does not want is just as bad as rape, and therefore abortion should be allowed?
No, I don't think it can be argued as such, because it is a very. I don't deny that there's certainly going to be psychological trauma entailed in giving birth to this child that was conceived in such a way, and it would very much be a reminder of that event. And if she doesn't want to raise the child, I make no qualms that she can give the child up for adoption or do something else with it.
That's not the same thing, because it still exists.
Yeah, it still exists, and she still went through the process of birthing it, all that. I don't deny that.
And you've also created a bad incentive, because you've essentially sent out a massive market signal to all people who are reproductively down on their luck, that basically if they can get away with actually having that happen, then they're good to go, because they're able to propagate their genes despite the fact that they're inadequate and don't deserve to be doing it.
Well, yeah, but that's why you build a society that fucking castrates rapists when they get caught or some shit like that. You make it
obviously
it to such a great degree that
this is not how criminals think, though. Criminals always think they're going to get away with it. So if you send the market signal that basically no matter what happens, their child is going to come into existence, then you've essentially just given them the green light.
Yeah, but if they might think they get away with it, but not many people are thinking that, oh yeah, let me just go plant my genes somewhere. Like, you're talking about such a tiny minority of people as to make it almost essentially irrelevant. It's like the where you're talking about essentially in the part one. It's like, rape to the point of having a civilization go extinct. Like, you're talking about it on such a massive scale that could be unseen.
These are of course meta questions, in the sense that it's a hypothetical, but it gives an indication.
That's what philosophers do.
Yeah, it gives an indication of where we are.
Yeah, sure. And obviously, it might negatively incent a few nut jobs, and we'll catch those few nut jobs and punish them for what they did. But again, child.
Really a few nut jobs, though, is that, as I was saying, though. Hold on. Is it really a few nut jobs if only 10%? Well, it's actually not even 10%. It's probably less than that of rapists are actually caught.
Where are you getting those numbers from? Just out of curiosity.
I don't have it in front of me, so I'm just pulling it out of the air, but I'm pretty sure that it's a very low percentage of rape cases that actually reach court, get prosecuted, and end up with a person in jail. It's a very low number. I'm sure it's below 10%. Someone correct me if I'm wrong again, but I'm pretty sure it's below 10%.
But what I was getting at with the whole is the consequences of forcing a woman to give birth. Are the psychological effects that comparable to that? Oh, something wrong?
Yeah, I just froze up and I didn't know if you guys were. Did you guys hear me?
No, I couldn't hear.
No.
But what I was trying to say was, what I was getting at with the question about whether or not the psychological impact of being forced to give birth to a child is comparable to the psychological impact of rape. I was actually sort of getting back into what I argued back in part one, and I think that what I asked complements my position that your rights end where mine begin. And if the fetus is violating a woman's right to remove that which has parasitic characteristics, then she has every right to. And as you just established, if she's forced to give a birth to that child, then she will suffer the psychological consequences that are comparable to something that should be outlawed because of what it does to women.
Okay, yeah, no. First off, just want to clarify something. I suppose you could say that a child in womb has parasitic characteristics. That doesn't make it a parasite, however. It is a completely
the literal definition, the dictionary definition of a parasite matches a fetus.
No, it doesn't, because parasites don't have whole organ systems built within the human body dedicated to bringing them to term. Parasites don't have that.
Okay, here's a different way of looking at it then. If you know that there are terrorist cells, for example, in a particular location, yes, and you know that there's a chance that when you actually hit this location with a drone strike, you're going to have some collateral damage that will be done. So, for instance, you may or may not kill someone else. Are you against carrying out any military operations in which collateral damage happens?
No.
Okay, so if you're not against that, then how can you also simultaneously be against abortion?
Because I don't see how the two are comparable.
Because if you say that one of these things is murder and the other is not, how do you rationalize that?
Well, it's still murder, obviously. It's a measure of degree, like all things. Like when it comes to terrorist cells are going to be taking lives at some point. And so if you have to sacrifice a few lives to save hundreds more, that's one thing. But this woman, with modern medical science, what are the chances, A, that this woman is going to die by giving birth, and B, if not, what is the damage being done here that needs to be protected from exactly? Like, are you making the case that the psychological trauma is such that it'd be better for the woman just to have the abortion?
Well, I'm making a case that it's just different variations of warfare.
Let's take this away from hypotheticals for a moment and look at some historical kind of context into this conversation, because it occurs to me that a lot of this is premised on like a modern confrontation with Catholicism, with these kind of ethical issues. But in the past, the Catholic Church and the Bible, and in the Catholic Bible, it has been the case that that there have been laws in Catholic countries, and certainly the Bible, there existed such references to such laws where if a man raped a woman, he could basically get out of trouble so long as he married the woman. And this conveniently solves your problem too, pragmatic. So now the kid's gonna be brought up, but it's something that I would hope that you would not endorse.
Yeah, no, I understand where those laws came from, but they're based on a more Levitical interpretation as opposed to New Testament. And like, obviously, I wouldn't say that a woman has to be raised, has to marry her rapist. That would be arguably even more traumatic than actually just bringing the child to term, because now she's living with the very criminal who committed the crime, as opposed to just the consequence of the crime.
So where does it? Where's in the New Testament that life begins at conception?
It's less of a matter of it being specifically written down in the New Testament, and more it's come from a series of philosophical inquiries, based on, Splesh and Neoplatonism, a little Aristotelianism, The Catholic
sounds really cancerous.
No, it's
Yes, it does.
I'm
The
being
question
very
I'm gonna
flippant with my philosophical terminology that I'm referencing right here. But the laws of the Catholic Church aren't strictly based on Scripture. We draw from outside philosophical sources in order to supplement with some of what the Bible doesn't make clear explicitly, and we draw from logic and reason.
Some better ones.
Also, I have
Sorry?
2 questions in response to that.
Sure.
The 2 questions I have are, firstly, with reference to the issue of not doing what Leviticus says, but in fact doing something slightly less than what Leviticus says. If you're not willing to obey a Semitic Bronze Age ideology as it is written, why should you obey any part of it at all, given that no one in this conversation is a Semite and no part of the world in which we live in is shaped by their cultural domination?
Jesus explicitly says in the book
Wait, hold on.
of Matthew,
There's a second part of the question as well. The second part of the question also is that if you're going to be drawing from other sources in order to create, I guess, quote, philosophical inquiry, which I assume is supposed to take on some tone of objectivity, what happens if we actually analyze this alleged objectivity and arrive at the conclusion that, in fact, there is no such objectivity and that there is clearly a class interest in the reason why people articulate the things which you are presently articulating? For example, you may want more workers to exist for the sake of having big bosses be able to drive down the cost of labor. That may be the reason that you're actually against birth control, except you won't actually tell me this, will you? So answer both of them, because obviously it's the two questions. The first one is that basically, why are people who are not actually from the Middle East being forced to obey Middle Eastern concepts? And the second one is, if it's actually not a Middle Eastern concept and it's watered down with lots of other stuff, how can we trust that the specific form of watering down which you have gone through is objective?
Okay,
and
so
I wanted to add
Because it's Catholic dogma.
I wanted to add something to what Ray said just a second ago about
sure, Nero, go ahead.
obeying. Correct me if I'm incorrect, but didn't Jesus say in Matthew 5:17 through 20 that the law of the prophets, i.e., people like Moses, you have to look towards what they said, what laws they wrote down during their time, and you have to obey those laws, or else you will basically go to hell. You cannot break one joint or little of the law, or some wording of that nature. Because he did say you should obey the Old Testament until the heavens and earth pass. And the book of Revelation hasn't happened yet, so.
Okay, well, all right. So there's a lot to unpack in that little addition, because Revelation is a whole other thing. The belief that Revelation is actually the end of the world isn't really true. It's a prefigurement of the Mass, and Protestants have sort of, like they've done with all doctrine, perverted it. But
is it the Hegelian end of history?
I'm not sure what you meant by that.
Continue.
I'm sorry. But anyway, Revelation aside, Jesus said that he came to not to abolish the old law, to fulfill it. So obviously we do have some respect we have to pay some respect to the old laws, but it is not the letter of the law that we have to respect. It is the spirit of the laws and what they were trying to inspire in us. So the idea behind something like the 10 Commandments isn't that, necessarily we have to go about, it's not that we have to be in fear every time we take the Lord's name in vain, although we shouldn't. It's that we ought to be respectful of God and what he's done for us, and so forth and so on. And you can take that with a lot of other Levitical laws too. But that being said, even Levitical laws aren't a single category. They're broken into a lot of different things. Like the dietary laws aren't the same as the moral laws. The dietary laws were specific to the Hebrews, as if you look at it from a sort of historical interpretation, those were meant more as God telling the Hebrews, okay, do this to survive so I can bring a savior from you and eventually use him to spread my message to the whole of people. So not all of the Levitical laws were strictly moral laws, and those are the part of the laws where, they don't apply to us because they're not really moral. And that's the goal of Jesus, is to instill in us the moral code of what the Old Testament was trying to do, but could not completely do because Jesus had not yet arrived. So to get to Ray's question of why Okay, what was your first question again, Ray? I've lost it a little bit.
Yeah, the question is that if you're not willing to actually obey Leviticus on the issue of forcing a woman to marry her rapist, for example, then because you admit that there's something obviously wrong with that, then why should we follow any part of Middle East, any ideology that has come out of the Middle East at all? After all, none of us are Middle Eastern.
Okay, so that's sort of fairly easy to answer. One is because, again, it's Christ came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law. So it has more to do with the spirit of what Leviticus was implying. And even so, I haven't looked. It's been brought up to my attention a lot of times, this specific law. I've done strikingly little research on it, though. So it could potentially be one of two things. It could be sort of one of those formal survival laws I mentioned, where God's saying, all right, the Hebrews, just kind of stick it out for some time, so eventually I can pull a Messiah from you and bring my message to the rest of the world. But what I think it more likely is saying that, the spirit of what God's trying to say is that this child is still a human life, and it still has worth that should not be disrespected just because of how it was conceived. And because of this respect, it, deserves a home, it deserves to be raised and things like that. And because, a family is better with both the mother and the father, you might as well take the child's actual father. And so that would be sort of my...
But the child's actual father is a criminal.
He is, yes. And that sort of sucks. But it's the best at the time, I imagine, it's sort of the best you could do. Because if you're a woman who is raped, it's the chances of you getting another husband are very, very low, most likely. Now,
yes, but isn't that due to the exact same values that same God had propagated? Because of the fact that obviously the shame culture and the form of patriarchy in session there is created by that exact same God. So it's kind of interesting that he creates the system that corrals them into that choice and then advocates a solution based on the scenario that he created.
It wasn't in terms of the ethics here and the collateral of the child. The Lord and Moses killed every firstborn child in Egypt to prove a point about the Pharaoh. It kind of seems that that this kind of sanctity of life versus punishment thing doesn't quite go the way you want it in the Bible, at least.
Yeah, well, it seems to apply only in specific situations which are useful for a specific ideological goal. Because, killing every single firstborn person in Egypt, this means that they killed, 2-year-olds. And then there's also the battle at Ai, for example, which is where I think I'm sure it was Moses, right? It was either Moses or Joshua had come there, basically, and they were having this gigantic battle in which they had invaded someone else's land. And then the people of Ai, who are apparently a peace-loving people, didn't have any weapons, so they came out with broomsticks, and the Jewish people destroyed them completely.
Okay.
So explain to me how that encompasses sanctity of life.
Okay, so to take each example step by step, first off, you have to remember what was done to Moses' generation of the Hebrews prior to that. It was the fact that, Moses and all his kin were murdered X number of years ago. All their firstborns were murdered X number of years ago. And so this is sort of God dealing out some... he put the reverse card down on Uno, and basically the Egyptians got it. Now, this is a form...
Pause there a second. If you can do that and have that kind of retribution card be played back at someone because allegedly they did such and such, then how can... Again, this is one of those things where, again, sanctity of life you're talking about doesn't seem to come into play here. In fact, it seems to sound more like the kind of thing I'm talking about, which is basically they did something to us, and therefore we did something back to them, which was exactly equivalent.
And this them is generational. It's not like...
And yeah, it's generational, because the children who were killed in that incident that we're talking about were not responsible for were not directly responsible for any of the things that happened, and yet they were targeted. So how come it's very strange and wrong if I say it, but not so strange and wrong if Moses says it?
Well, first and foremost, it's not just Moses saying it. And again, it's this situation where the children who were murdered by in Egypt, I should say, weren't this... Well, they had an option, obviously. They could have been spared if Pharaoh had let those people go. So it wasn't as if they're, as if this is something that's completely out of the blue, as if there wasn't an option for them to be saved. There was always the chance. That chance was not given to the Israelite children.
Well, the rapist could have just not raped.
What? I'm not getting the comparison.
Well, the comparison here is that like the rapist is the analog for the pharaoh here, and the
Okay.
children.
Yeah.
I get what you're
So,
saying, but like
exactly, so, I mean,
the
I guess
pharaoh
if
would
he
have
didn't-
been doing
he didn't
something
want people
good
to
by
abort his
letting the
fetus.
people go in the first place. It's not as if the rapist could have just not done the bad thing. It's like pharaoh could have done something objectively good. Avoiding evil and doing good are, while similar concepts, are still two different ones, and so it's not a valid comparison.
No.
Well,
You
no,
can
the
make
pharaoh was
no,
still
within the
not doing
context.
anything.
Exactly,
He
and
was
within the
not taking
context.
He was owning another people as a slave race. That's the thing.
No, but I mean,
They were going to leave.
hold on.
He had to act to stop them.
Also, within the context of the present day, I mean, technically, the rapist could have chosen not to rape, and he could have additionally done something very good, such as open his wallet and give all of his money to the woman.
No, but he wasn't initially doing anything bad. Pharaoh had been propagating this system that enslaved the Hebrews. He was doing something objectively wrong. The rapist, before he does the raping, isn't doing anything wrong. He's not morally corrupt at that
Well, I mean,
point.
technically, he is existing within a patriarchal framework in
Impure
which
thoughts are
he is,
also a sin.
yeah, in which he has money and the woman has less money than him on average. So technically, he is doing something wrong. Maybe he should. Again, that's why I said he should just open his wallet and give her all of his money. Then.
All right. Well, this is a question.
By the same
Again,
logic.
this is shifting the goalposts to like, well, do we really live in a patriarchal society? Is it unfair that he has all this money? X, Y, Z. Like, the situation has been stretched so beyond the hypothetical about what we're talking about in this scenario. But I want to answer first and foremost. I'll answer the second part because I think we've covered.
Yeah, the battle of Ai is the one that I really wanted to focus on, which is basically the Israelites that you're discussing have entered someone else's territory in the Levant, have come across them, arrived outside their city gates. The people have announced that basically they don't have any weapons because they're actually a peace-loving people, and then they're all killed anyway. Explain this.
Okay, so I am no biblical historian, so this event in particular I have never heard brought to my attention, and so it is new to me. So I cannot give you the perfect explanation as for why.
I am pretty sure it's that famous story where I think someone is asked to raise their hands in the air, and whenever they raise their hands in the air, it was written, what was it, the people of Israel prevailed, and whenever Moses' hands were down, then the people of Ai prevailed, even though they were using farm tools or whatever. But either which way, they all ended up getting wiped out. Now that seems to me to not be a respect for life. If you come across a town which is peaceful and basically the Abrahamic God commands them to wipe it out.
Well, first and foremost, it seems weird to me that a bunch of people who just came out with broomsticks are suddenly losing just because Moses suddenly lowers his hand. So I don't
We're
think.
supposed to say that God works in mysterious ways.
Well, no, it sounds to me like they had a little bit more than just broomsticks if they were actually at any point winning the battle, God's graces or not. But besides
indeed, it's very strange. But I mean, the more salient part of this point, though, is the fact it's the fact that the Israelites were in someone else's territory, attacking them aggressively.
Yeah, no. First and foremost, again, not a biblical historian. I can't give the perfect answer. If I were to give my educated guess on the situation, however, the pagan cultures that inhabited Canaan at that time were, peace-loving in the same way that the Muslims who sort of swept through North Africa and the Middle East at the time were peace-loving.
No, I have to push back on that. The thing which is actually comparable to Islam in this case would in fact be the Israelites themselves, because they were the ones in fact sweeping through the Levant, hitting everything that they came across.
Well, they were the original owners. They were the original owners of the Levant. The Canaanites who came to inhabit it after them. Well, obviously, I'm not saying they're exactly comparable to Islam in how they went about acquiring the land, but I'm talking more in terms of their practices. There was histories of ritual human sacrifice and a whole slew of other, what we would consider today, crimes against humanity of some sorts. And usually,
most cultures in the world have had that.
At some point, sure. And I think of the example.
The only people whose religion don't have these things that you're talking about are Judaism and Islam.
Why not? What do you mean, not Islam?
I said Judaism and Islam are the only ones that don't have the kind of things that you're talking about, which is why you end up with this problem. Because then you end up with essentially Islamists claiming that they have a right to sweep through your territory and destroy you because you are pagans or whatever.
Okay, but Islamists are also wrong. But besides that, you could obviously have the theological debate about who's actually right and how Muslims are in fact comparable to pagans in some ways. But I would also
how is that? How could that possibly be so? Muslims are clearly part of a monotheistic position, which is their whole claim to fame is basically they stomped their way through the entirety of Central Asia, annihilating anything that looked like it was pagan. That's what they did, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, they
and
basically outlawed
and that's what the Spanish did when they came to the New World
when
too.
When they arrived in the New World, the first thing that they did was essentially grab a couple slaves and then set about annihilating everyone that they encountered.
Yeah, they wiped out the people who built. They wiped out a people who built a temple on something like a couple million skulls. I'm real sad about it, because I mean we're talking about societies that committed atrocities on scales that, if we were to put them in proportion, are comparable to that of something along like the Holodomor or possibly even the Holocaust in terms of what they were able to do.
That accounting though, when the Spanish killed all of them, and they killed a proportion of their population. It's not like
it wasn't the Aztec population. They sacrificed people from their neighboring tribes. It wasn't even their own.
No, but it's kind of like it's kind of like you enter into the
and we're enslaved too.
It's like you enter into It's like you enter into a situation, see that some people are killing some people, and decide to kill everyone, and then come back afterwards and pose that you're the moral superior here.
Well,
that's kind of weird.
Let me jump in for quickly. It would be like if the Soviets decided that because of what the Germans did to the Jews, that the Soviets have the right to basically kill every single German in existence.
Which would be completely insane. Exactly.
Well, they should have the right to do that for other reasons, but let's not get into that.
the eternal German, but
the eternal Russian also. Be careful of that.
But there's certain cultures and there are certain ways of life that at the time, how do you deal with a hostile force if you're just trying to occupy their land? The answer is, you get modern day Israel.
You're just trying to occupy their land.
Well, you get a society if you're trying to coexist with this other people, and they have a history of barbarism.
Nonsense.
Sorry?
The Spanish were not trying to coexist. That's nonsense. You look at Cortez.
Well, no, I'm not talking about the Spanish now. I'm talking about the Canaanites and the Israelites again. But if you're talking, think about how the modern state of Israel exists with Palestine at this very moment. It's a very tentative relationship.
And that it should not.
What?
And that it should not.
Well, no. What I'm saying is that at the time, I'm not saying that it should not be. Well, I wish it would not be, but I understand why it is. And of course, those reasons why societies have been unstable because of ethnic and cultural diversity have persisted throughout the whole of human history. And so what you have God doing is saying, well, all right, I have this people here. I'm working my salvation through them, and I need to make sure they live long enough so I can eventually plot my son down amongst them, and he can spread the word eventually to not only them, but to the rest of the Gentile world.
Okay, pause, because this is, I'm sorry to have to pause here. I know, because it annoys me when I do it, when other people do it to me, but I have to do it in this particular case. By the same logic then, which is basically the sort of consequentialist logic of basically you have to survive up until a particular point, then by that same logic, you could support the state of Myanmar and what it's presently engaged in, or you could support the Empire of Japan in the Second World War under the logic that, and brace for it, the purpose of continuing to fight the war is to make sure that the future is safe for Dharma transmission so that Buddhism will exist in the world forever.
Are you quoting?
They are not God's people.
No, it's not a quotation. It's not a quotation. It's just a justification that existed, right? So
yeah, no, I know.
I mean, why can they? So by the same logic, you then have to argue that Japan and Myanmar in 1943 were, quote, justified in actually going into Arakan province and destroying every single human being that existed in that territory.
Well, first off, the reason I was asking if you were quoting anything is because I've heard Zizek talk a lot about the Zen justifications and how they helped the Japanese. So I was just wondering if there was any correlation there.
No, it's not necessarily a quotation, but there's the idea that in order to have Dharma transmission, you have to have particular people who have engaged in particular actions, transmitting it directly, person to person, from one person to the other, and so it doesn't work in the abstract. And so what that then means is that if you have an existential threat to the propagation of that, then it then can be, through a series of hoops that you have to jump through, be justified to defend Buddhism by actually going on the offensive. So I mean, plenty of people will say that you're not allowed to do that because what that actually constitutes is a form of aggressive warfare. Yet you're able to apply that same logic only when Israelis engage in it. Well, so it's almost like they're allowed to do it, but the rest of us cannot.
Well, no. If you will allow me to finish, I think you mentioned
Isn't that the actual Catholic dogma, though, that they are God's chosen people, and that's why they were able to do it?
It's a little bit more than just that, but that is certainly part of it. But to talk to you mentioned Myanmar, present day, you said, right? Because I don't know, I was unaware of some like historical atrocity, but you were talking about like what Myanmar and the Buddhists are doing.
Present day as well, because it's all one arc of trajectory that stems from about 1886 to present, and so the Second World War simply encompassed part of that because the British Empire had promised Muslims from Chittagong province in Bangladesh the ability to set up a caliphate in the middle of Myanmar if they would help the Allies. To which obviously Axis was not pleased about this and promptly invoked the imperative to defend Buddhism as the counterposition to once again reignite what had been ignited before. And so I think the time that you're seeing in the present day with Myanmar is probably about the 5th time that this has happened now.
Sure.
And each time it has happened, the West has said you're not allowed to actually have that war.
Yeah, no, I understand.
Yes, you are here saying that the Israelis are allowed to do that exact thing.
Well, no, I would make the case that obviously I would prefer that they not go around and the people of Myanmar not go around and do it via murder and violent bloodshed and things like that. But I understand the position they're in, and I'm sympathetic to it. Would I like them to go about doing it through simple maybe exile all of them from the country in the same way that Pakistan and India had that big separation so many years ago? Would I like them, all the Muslims in Myanmar,
who's going to accept them?
Bangladesh, I would say.
Okay, so by your logic, Bangladesh should accept every single person of Muslim religion from Arakan province.
There is a refugee crisis going on as a result of what the Buddhists are doing in Myanmar.
And so what I'm saying is that by the normal logic, you'd actually call that ethnic cleansing, and then you'd still get in trouble for it, right?
Hold on, who's being ethnically cleansed by my definition?
The people being ethnically cleansed would be the people of Arakan province, then, right?
The Muslims being kicked out.
Yeah. And so by your logic, why? So it's still the same question, just formulated slightly differently now. I.e., why are they not allowed to do that? I should say. Whereas you're arguing that some groups of people, such as the Israelis, for example, are allowed to do this. And furthermore, regardless of what your answer to that question is, how does this gel with the right to life?
Well, again, like I said, I'd prefer they do it just via exile, but I do believe that this ethnic cleansing, so to speak, isn't. I think ethnic cleansing is a very, very charged term, but largely, I think something like what would be engaged through the process of exile or something, it's by all means really a quote unquote peaceful ethnic cleansing, no bloodshed has been brought about. And that's like the type of thing I would advocate for if it's possible. Now, the key phrase is there, if it's possible. I recognize there are certain situations around the world where, in order to, again, it goes back to the system of do I disagree with drone strikes that might have collateral? And the answer to that is no. And allow me to weave that into this. Obviously, if some lives need to be taken in order to save more, that's something that just has to be done. And if there is no chance for a peaceful separation and a peaceful chance for these ethnicities to go both of their ways, and if these two ethnicities stay together, there's just going to be greater bloodshed, then I understand why certain actions have to be taken. It's the same reason I understand why we dropped the nukes on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, because if we had tried to invade, there would have been casualties in the millions on both sides. And so even though this was a horrible loss of life, hundreds of thousands of innocents literally lost their lives, it ended up saving millions more in the process. And so I'd say
by the same logic, what if we take that to the genetic level and we talk about children purely on the genetic level and child surrogates purely on the genetic level? By that logic, you could also argue that abortion is good because it preserves that element of the ethnic group which ought to have existed, as opposed to the one which is not supposed to have existed. Because again, you just differentiated there in the case of where you discussed Myanmar just now. You just differentiated between the people of Myanmar excluding the people of Arakan province by making that distinction and saying that to save one group, you need to sort of sacrifice people from another group.
Well, it's not that you need to save just the one group. It's for the harmony of both groups, I would say, because you're having this constant fighting back and forth where both groups are losing lives. So it's for the betterment of both groups that they be separated and go their own ways, really.
Okay, well then this takes us right back to the beginning of the conversation, which is where you had these sort of sexual assault unions, if you want to call them that. Isn't the ultimate separation to not allow these things to occur?
No, the ultimate separation is just not to have the father be involved in the situation. And again, the child, I know.
The child is half of one ethnic group and half of the other, and you've already recognized that ethnicity as a driving force in history simply through engaging in this conversation.
Sure.
Then you cannot say that having a child conceived without the consent of the mother, which is half one ethnicity and half the other, should exist because of some universal human ideal, which you've just refuted.
No, I haven't refuted my own ideal. And this child, there's a difference between two large groups of many people of different ethnicities living together, and those two ethnicities being represented in a single child who is not guilty of any crime. Those are two largely different things. And I would continue to argue, to get back to the talking about the Israeli cleansing of like the pagans from the land of Canaan. As I've said, collateral damage is a thing. You have to break a few eggshells to make an omelet as such. And so what ends up happening with Israeli is like they're not going to convince the people of Canaan to leave that land peacefully. Obviously they can't coexist without great strife and even more lives being lost in the long term. So really the only option for a peaceful existence for, one of those people is for either one to be wiped out. And obviously because, chosen people and such, it just happened to be the Jews in that scenario.
Well, I hate to actually point this out, but it just so happened to be them is one of those things where I kind of feel like if they're the ones writing their own story, you would think that they would say that themselves are the chosen. Like, have you ever come across an ethnic group other than Europeans, I should think? Have you ever come across an ethnic group who thinks that someone other than themselves is the chosen ones?
I've very rarely actually heard other ethnicities refer in any religion to themselves as chosen per se. I've heard them refer to themselves as some sort of special, or they have some sort of descendants from the gods and such. But I think Jews are actually unique in their chosenness.
Which is about the same as saying that you are chosen, right? Because if you believe that your own religion cannot go on without your presence there, then that means essentially you are chosen, right? So everyone believes that they're chosen, except for Christians who believe that someone other than themselves is chosen.
Well, no, there was a doctrine of conversion in Judaism. It can be noted because later on in the Bible, after they had settled in the land for some time, they did eventually. There were some neighbors who claimed they wanted to live peacefully, and in order to do that, there was some show of, "Hey, we're going to get circumcised and we're going to be you guys. We're going to be like you guys now." So it wasn't like the doctrine of conversion was completely absent from Judaism.
Yeah, wasn't there assimilation that occurred as a consequence of that?
Oh, hey, Natsuki.
So we talk about fucking Israel and fucking...
We're talking ancient Israel at the moment.
Oh, go on.
We'll discuss modern Israel maybe sometime later in the stream, though, but yeah.
Yeah, sure. But anyway, would it have probably been better if like these people just, got up and left? Sure. But they were probably going to be like Pharaoh. They were going to be stubborn and, you just got to save the time at some point.
So yeah, Jews can get away with genocide because they're chosen people. That's basically what you're saying, dude.
It sounds pretty bad to me.
Again, it goes back to the logic I was presenting earlier. I mean, yeah, you might not like another person's culture because, they might do something fucked up, like they might do child sacrifice or whatever. Well, that doesn't mean you're going to indiscriminately kill them. And also, you say they needed their resources. Then why?
No, I don't think I said that.
The Jews also get rid of the Canaanites' livestock and other resources as well?
I don't think I said that they needed their resources. I think it was simply a claim on the land. If I did, I didn't mean to say it, but
I think I agree that it had to be up in a claim on the land because the the fact that they actually killed the livestock and all this other stuff was almost like it was exceptionally sort of, making the point to make sure that everyone understood that what they were doing was a genocide.
Well, yeah, I'm not denying that it was. I'm saying I have come to a weird position on this, and I wouldn't say this is a case where I would just let Israel get away with it. There are certain times I've come to this weird position, and this is separate from my theology at this point, obviously, that genocide is kind of just gonna happen, and it's bad that it happens, but it's almost like a natural sort of cyclical thing to me at this point. And I don't necessarily put, obviously, if it couldn't happen, I'd like it not to happen. But it seems like at this point, we used to have disease and stuff doing the genociding, and we used to have all these other natural things doing it. And now that we've kind of, since agricultural revolution and such, it's kind of seems inevitable that it's just going to happen one way or another. Like, you wish it wouldn't, but it just kind of does, is how I'd put it.
Okay, well, now I will reveal the reason why I took us on this massively long detour, because it's been a while to get all the way here.
It has
because that statement which you just made, how can you then make this statement which you just made after we took this long detour, which must have been about an hour of detour, really? How can you then make this statement you just made and then turn around afterwards and invoke sanctity of life because abortion?
Because,
how do these two things exist within the same person?
Disease and genocide just happening doesn't mean you should stop life right before it gets the chance to go out there and live. I mean, again...
I'm just saying that if you have a universal moral position, right? If you're already up to your neck in blood already, what is a little more at that point?
It's a little more that shouldn't be there.
Oh my god.
Pragmatic. I actually wanted to add something to what Ray said earlier about the whole bombing another country to get rid of terrorists, resulting in some innocent people being killed in the process. That's no proportionality thing. Can probably go on a 1-hour rant about how proportionality works. But I think what Ray was trying to get at was that in both scenarios, you have a necessary evil. So in essence, what me and Ray did in part one was we brought up countries like Romania or the Catholic countries in Africa, or what would have happened if Roe v. Wade never happened. And we said that abortion is necessary because every time you outlaw it, in the vast majority of cases, the consequences simply aren't desirable and actually hurt society in the long term. So if that is the case, if we were to accept that's okay to bomb terrorists, which might result in the loss of innocent life, then it's perfectly okay to allow women to have abortions under that same pretense, because the alternatives are much worse.
Well, again, I disagreed with this belief that just because you have more children means X societal consequences. I understand the correlation exists.
It's been empirically demonstrated that outlawing abortion leads to higher crime rate.
That is different from the place that we went just now, though. The only thing I was trying to do just now is that, obviously, from my perspective, like, I don't think that it's a necessary evil problem, because I don't think it's an evil at all. But I'm saying that if you do believe that there is an evil involved somewhere, how can you say that there is a necessary evil in the case of the massive case that we just described of people invading each other and, like, massive death occurring and so on, and say that's a necessary evil, but then also turn around and say that you can't have abortion because that's not a necessary evil?
Okay, I'll answer your question, and then I'll just respond to something I'm seeing in the chat real quick. But no, I understand. Obviously, one is a necessary evil because it's on a societal scale, I would say. And you have the whole total conflicts in society. Like, just because I think genocides are just going to happen doesn't mean I don't want to try to avoid them as best they can. And so I think, this sort of societal separation of
hold on, let me just jump in there as well. If I were to paraphrase what you just said, I could also say that quotation, because this is not my position, but just one that I assume that there's someone out there who holds this position. They could say that someone could say that they are against abortion, right? Or that they're not keen on seeing abortions happen, but they would like to prevent as many abortions as possible while knowing that they're going to happen anyway.
Yes.
Therefore, such a person would support the provision of birth control to prevent that from happening in the first place, and then the ones that slip through, you abort them.
Okay, so this is a bit of a different discussion.
Of abortions, even though they happen anyway. right? So you could use that exact same logic you're using on the genocide thing on the abortion thing.
Well, again, I think it's a degree, it's a thing of scale, because one is on a societal level, one is on an individual level. But you do make an interesting point in that you could make the case that there are some necessary evils that needed to be let happen and maybe regulated a little bit in order so that greater evils don't occur. Thomas Aquinas actually did make a similar case in where he said prostitution should be allowed and legalized and regulated, but in order to make sure that it doesn't happen as much as it does.
Because if the prostitution's contained in brothels, then the sins that occur within the brothels don't linger on in the rest of society because it's kept behind closed doors.
Yeah, now that's somewhat debatable because obviously we're more aware of STDs now, so that has to be taken into account. But I'm more sympathetic to the idea that you allow some bad things along those lines to happen in order to let a few other things go. And I would be sympathetic to the case that maybe we keep birth control around to allow and outlaw something like abortion, so you get a little less of it and you prevent the greater evil, which in my mind would be abortion, and you allow birth control. However, in an ideal world, I would still desire there to be none of either, because again, they're still evils, they're just evils of a different degree.
Yeah, but I do want to add one thing though before we continue this. I don't mean to be rude, but can we discuss other issues very quickly? Because
no worries.
I kind of did promise NatSec we would talk about FISA and Russian collusion and stuff like that sometime.
Yeah, sure. I'll just we can end this conversation, and I'll let you guys say some final words. I would just want to respond to this Christy Santiago lady. I don't know. She's accusing me of cognitive dissonance. There's just which I get. I can understand how it sounds that way, but it's just this is a very long and short conversation at the same time about a concept that is full of a lot of nuance and full of a lot of deep philosophy and theology that I'm not the best in any way, shape, or form of getting out. So forgive me of my shortcomings if I'm not the best conveyor of my ideology. It's I'm a human being at the end of the day. But is there anything else you guys would like to wrap up on?
I mean, the only thing I really wanted to say on the abortion topic is, even if the fetus is a human, I would argue that abortion is a necessary evil because, as I was getting into, outlawing abortion is linked with higher crime rates, higher rates of poverty, higher STDs. It seems that outlawing this practice, even if it really is evil, as you say, the greater evil is the complete lack of social cohesion. And we can see that with the Freakonomics study I cited in part 1, where if abortion remained outlawed in most states, if Roe v. Wade never came into fruition, crime rates would have been very high in the 90s. I mean, yes, Bill Clinton was tough on crime, but if it weren't for outlawing abortion, if abortion wasn't seen as a constitutional right in 1973, yes, it might suck to say that if abortion wasn't outlawed, then
no. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I mean, it might suck to say that, yes, like you said, you don't like the idea that by outlawing abortion, you're creating a generation of criminals, but there's a lot of truth to that, unfortunately. Granted, not all.
My problem isn't that it's not. I didn't mean to say it's creating a generation. It's creating a generation of criminals. My problem is that by saying that, well, you have a larger population, so obviously there are going to be more criminals because the population is larger. I'm against this idea that larger population, more criminals, therefore abortion kills criminals. Like, I'm against that sort of reasoning because it's just an argument of well, yeah, if you spend more time around fire, you're more likely to get burnt. It's just it's an argument sort of like, if you drive cars more often, you're more likely to have a car accident. It's sort of like these self-evident things that doesn't really imply a moral response in the terms of allowing an evil to occur.
It does apply because in the end, do you want the kind of culture you see in third world countries to be rampant in a first world situation? No, you do not want that to happen. And abortion is one of the things that prevents what me and Ray argue is overpopulation. And obviously,
well,
poverty is all a part of that.
Well, I have quite the different opinion on quote unquote overpopulation, and I think the issues Africa is facing is much less an issue of overpopulation and much more an issue of both cultural and institutional deficit. And of course, there's some genetics in there as well, but I think it extends well beyond their just having a population that might be too large for them at this particular time. But I understand the argument.
I also want to address something I'm seeing in the chat here, which is Philip Daniel asked a question, which I assume is a facetious question because it can't possibly be a sincere question.
Mm-hmm.
He asks, quote, how could it have been a genocide if the ancient Hebrews were people of color? Quote, they could not have been possibly engaged in colonialism, genocide, or mass enslavement of the other. That's a ridiculous question. Like, that's kind of like one of those sort of like memeing the left kind of questions. I'm pretty sure that people of color are capable of engaging in all of these activities because they have. So I'm not sure why he's asking that question. Like, I mean, I'm sure I mentioned during the course of this conversation the rise of Islam in the Arabian desert and its expansion, which was obviously a form of colonialism, obviously a form of imperialism, obviously enslavement, and obviously genocide occurred as a consequence of this. So I am not sure why anyone would be asking that question.
Yeah, well,
maybe it's in the context of third worldism.
He just said in the chat that he is indeed memeing, but
okay.
It's I think it's you're one of those leftists who is more honest about situations like that, because a lot of people buy into the whole power plus prejudice narrative and apply that to a broad swath of things.
Well, it can still apply in those cases too, because for example, if you analyzed society under Muhammad after he had risen, you could apply power plus prejudice equals you know what, and then come to the conclusion that clearly the Arabs had a high tier position in the social order they had established, and that they were oppressing everyone else underneath them. I mean, that's literally what was happening.
Sure, you can make that case. I don't personally choose to use that narrative, but again, you have a good way of explaining it. That's why I enjoy talking to you. I see Christy Santiago again in the chat saying, she forgives me for my cognitive dissonance. All theists have it. I guess I don't know if she's one of yours, Ray, or maybe I pulled her over from one of my appearances on the Non Sequitur show or something. But thanks, Christy. I really crave that forgiveness.
How many people got on the stream?
Well, Watts showed up. How you doing, Watts? Sorry, we've been ignoring you.
No. It's fine. I'm not religious, so I couldn't really help you defend your position, and I didn't want it to be 3 versus 1. So, but I'm okay. Yeah, sorry, I was trying to sleep, but I ended up just napping and I ended up being late. But as far as abortion is concerned, I got to get off here, but I'll wrap up on that. I'm agnostic, but I'm very pro-life. It's the only position that I've never changed on. I'd have to look more into the statistics about crime and poverty that Platonic brought up. I've never heard about that before. I think it'd be interesting for me to look into and talk about it more.
You can also look at Romania and many other countries that outlawed abortion and the disastrous consequences that came about as a result of those policies.
Well, I have a friend in the chat who's telling me that the Freakonomics study on abortion is flawed, and he's citing a couple other studies there in the chat if you want to actually take a look below, Nero.
Okay. But I already dealt with that. I believe I did that when Ghost of Buckley tried arguing that the Freakonomics study got that wrong, but I'll take a look at it, I suppose.
But I'd have to look into it myself as well. But I think the bottom line for me, as far as that is concerned, is I don't think that a child is a matter of economic convenience or even criminal convenience, for that matter. And I don't think that could really justify the murder of a child, especially by its own mother.
Pause 1 second, because I mean, I hate to play this card, but your avatar is literally an eagle perched atop a fasces. So I'm not sure how you can then argue that you can't have human life subjected as a matter of convenience if, as far as I can understand, you're literally a far-right advocate of a fascist ideology. You are already doing this.
The fasces is a really old symbol that's not tied to just the fascists of the 20th century. I think it's an interesting symbol. I like the idea of synergy, of class unity. I like those ideas, and I like the symbology behind it.
No, but if you invoke this, but that's what I'm precisely what I'm getting at. If you invoke,
oops, sorry about that.
Yeah, I'm saying that.
Oh,
You've
fuck.
got two of yourself in.
I'm fucking. I don't know what's happening right now. Hold on. I don't know. Hold on. Yeah, that was an experience. All right.
That was terrible.
Yeah.
Can we move
I'm,
on
s-
to
I'm saying
FISA?
as if you're advocating class unity, which is what the fascism represents, that is an economic imperative that you're invoking there. So you can't say that, oh, you can't sacrifice X because economics, when you're advocating an ideological position which involves members of different classes making specific sacrifices for the sake of unity.
It depends on the sacrifice, though.
Yeah, he does have a point. There's
Well,
a
that's a
difference
more granular position, but you can't say that you're against all sacrifices then.
No, I'm not against all sacrifices for economic prosperity in general. I'm against the sacrifice of children for economic prosperity by its own mother. Is what I would say.
Okay, I mean, I hate to put it this way, but why?
Because I think it's wrong. I think it's
Okay,
inhuman.
okay. Where does that sense of wrongness on that issue come from?
I just don't think mothers should be allowed to kill their children, point blank.
Okay,
I
so what if
I don't have a religious position on it, so I guess it's not as.
That's why I was asking. Because I was
Correct.
thinking, okay, is it kind of like the invisible God or the secularized God, where you've taken a religious position and you've secularized it? So let me give you an example then. Let's say that you're in the Republic of Vietnam, which is an unfortunate place to be, but let's say that you were. And after Agent Orange had been used, let's say that you've got an incidence of sort of random birth defects in random wombs all over the place, right? Would you say that it's not acceptable for these women to engage in abortion in order to make sure that only the healthy fetuses come to term so that that nation can be economically prosperous and thus capable of defending itself and advancing in the world? Would you say that, would you say that the right to life of mutated fetuses trumps the economic prosperity of Vietnam?
Yes.
Well, that's insane. I have to actually point that out.
Okay,
There is
that's fine.
from my conception, there is nothing that trumps the survival and economic prosperity of the group. Nothing.
Well, you're a disgusting materialist, Ray. So
evil dialectic materialist.
you have to be an absolute
this is
idealist, right?
not. I mean, this is not exclusive. I mean, this is not even. I would even point out this is not even a position which is exclusive to the left. I mean, technically.
No, you're
I'm
absolutely
saying it,
right.
Yeah, I'm saying it from the left, but I mean, technically, Adolf Hitler could have said the exact same thing. And so I think this is a cross spectrum position, which is only differed from by you guys. So you guys would be the minority in this case, not necessarily me.
But wait, okay, can we since
Yeah.
I invited Natsek here for a specific topic, can we discuss Russian collusion and FISA and maybe Edward Snowden?
I think we've kind of beaten this topic to death. So
yeah, I mean, we've been discussing it for at least an hour and 20 minutes. So
yeah. Was there anything in particular? Because we did go over it in the first one. Thank you, Watts, for showing up when you could. Was there anything in particular that we want to go over? We kind of went over how obviously there is Russian collusion present. We have to judge whether or not how much they've done is taking advantage of an organic homegrown ideology that's actually risen up versus how much of it has sort of been implanted by the Russians themselves. You wanted to go over FISA specifically, right, Nero?
Natsek did, but I wanted to say was I don't know if this was brought up last time because I didn't watch all of part 2 yet, but I did watch one video, but I forgot the name of the video, but it showed that the Russians aren't just backing right-wingers, they're not just backing the alt-right in the US, but they also are basically causing drama by supporting even left-wing groups, so that way America would be more divided.
So they're being Israel, is what you're telling me right now. they're backing both sides of the horse.
Yeah, they're backing both sides of the American. They're basically backing both the radical left, like Black Lives Matter, and they're backing the radical right, the extreme alt-right, and they're trying to create more division among Americans by supporting both sides, both the extremes on both sides of the political spectrum.
However, they're not doing it in equal measure, though. What
Yeah,
they're doing
it's
is
a fair assessment.
they're supporting mostly the right, and then only in specific districts where they believe that it may be possible to split the Democratic support. Then, in such cases, they'll support something to the left of whatever the Democrat is. But their primary focus is indeed on electing Republicans.
That's like, I did want to bring this up though. That it's nothing to do with Trump per se.
Before you go on, apparently, the scum Jim Jordan and who was it, Meadows, are pushing for impeachment of Rosenstein. Oh, I would love to see their heads on spikes.
Jim Jordan was the one representative, right?
Yeah, one of them, and then there's Meadows as well.
Okay. Well, all right. Let's get into this then. Why are you so mad that they want to impeach Rosenstein?
Because he's done nothing wrong, literally.
Wait, hold on. I didn't hear that for a second. I was lost at the part where you said Jim, what's his name, and Mike Meadows, was it you said?
Yeah, at least
Mark
the last
Meadows,
name.
sorry.
No, I don't know his name, but last name, yeah. They're pushing for impeachment for Rosenstein. Apparently they've put out an articles of impeachment. The thing being, he's literally done fucking nothing wrong.
What do they want? I don't know. I've done very little to almost no research.
I don't even know.
What are they accusing him of exactly?
I'm going to read the document, but so apparently it's to do with fucking Christ. He made this clear in his fucking hearing. Apparently it's because he's failed to produce documents to Congress. Despite in his hearing, he's literally appointed more people to get more shit sent across to Congress. Okay, they requested documents from him, and he's provided a fair few of them in his testimony, and to speed up the process to meet up the demands of the incompetent Congress. GOP Republicans, he assigned even more staff to the fucking job.
But if you, all right, I get what you're saying. You know, it's a slow, tough process. It's bureaucracy, so forth and so on. But
because it's taken its time, these literal fucktards are trying to impeach him for doing nothing.
Well, if they started by asking him for, and I don't know this, so maybe they didn't, but if they started by asking him for specific documents and documents in particular, and he's sort of been delaying that, why does he need more staff to get those particular documents, and why didn't he just produce them in the first place?
Because these guys may not hold particular clearances that's needed. Congressional oversight gets you so far. For example, the Gang of Eight, they can see more than the rest of the committees can, and all the rest of it, right? So,
sure.
It's a slow process because it's an ongoing investigation and all the rest of it, right? And the executive, in terms of these agencies and departments, are superior to Congress, and the GOP's weaponized these oversight bodies in favor of a Russian agent in the White House, and that being Trump. He should be the one who's impeached, not a fine gentleman like Rosenstein.
All right. Well,
also,
I'm going to disagree with you there because I don't think there's any proof that Trump is in any way an agent of Russia, as opposed to simply just backed by them.
He's walking around doing literally ridiculous things. Hold on. Just wait a second.
Literally ridiculous things.
Yeah, he's walking around doing literally ridiculous things. You saw today. Just what? All right, go on.
Thank you. Okay, so the fact is that Donald Trump has had contacts with the KGB since, I'm quoting from memory, 1983. So if he's had contacts with
87.
an adversary agency since the 1980s, and we have seen evidence from the broad intelligence community that Russia assisted the Trump campaign to increase the likelihood that he would win the election. And Donald Trump's policies, with the few exceptions, of course, but he's throwing darts essentially. With a few exceptions, Donald Trump's foreign policy is very convenient to the Russian national interest.
Really?
I don't think it's rational to say.
How so though? Hold on, go back. You got to support that last claim. How is it convenient for the Russian national interest, because by my count, he has installed missiles in Poland. He has been providing weapons to Ukraine. He has now done missile strikes on Syria twice. He has imposed further sanctions upon them. This really doesn't seem like it's particularly convenient to the Russian national interest.
Well, first of all, about the Ukrainian
hold on.
weapons.
It's because of this.
I'm going to respond to that one claim, and then you can go on. I'm sorry. About Ukraine, Trump is not directly sending weapons to Ukraine. What he did is he's allowing American manufacturers to freely send weapons to the Ukrainian government, to make contracts with the Ukrainian government. Now, to me, that was more or less of a way to say, if he ever got impeached, oh, how could I be a Russian agent if I did something contrary to their interests? But what he did wasn't really that impactful. And Russia is still using proxy cells to obtain territory in the Ukraine that would allow for Russia to reverse oil sanctions or natural gas sanctions on the European Union.
Okay,
and
but
Trump has not doubled down on this issue, so that's evidence, in my opinion.
I mean,
Go on, Graham.
I don't think inaction is evidence of bias, because I mean, again, this is more than Obama was doing. Obama actually pulled out of installing the missiles and doing these things. But I mean, of course, I don't find it surprising that Trump isn't directly sending weapons to Ukraine. The U.S. is bound to international law in a way that, you know, Russia kind of just flaunts it off. The U.S. actually has to uphold it to some degree. And so I can't imagine that, you know, sending weapons directly to these warring parties is like in particular.
Trump hasn't pressured Russia at all. He hasn't condemned them for.
He's increased sanctions on them, though.
He hasn't. There's been no.
He did not do that. What ended up happening?
Placed on allies. I go for it, Ray.
Yeah, basically what's happening is that we need to disambiguate the things which were the inertia that the United States was already under versus what Trump's ideal trajectory is. Trump's trajectory has not always been met with a total rollover by the American establishment, which is why things have proceeded at a pace which is slower than he would like. So, for example, on day one, when Trump got in, the first action which he actually wanted to commit, he wanted to actually undo the sanctions on Russia. He was prevented because a bunch of career diplomats in the State Department actually prevented him from being able to do this by engaging in lots and lots of obfuscation and just simply not showing up in all kinds of other obstructionist measures. However, if it had been left up to Trump to do it, and we know this because of the fact that the NBC actually reported it straight from the mouth of the persons involved, if it had been left up to Trump, he would have removed sanctions on day one of his presidency. He has tried twice again since then, and has been unable to do it because of the fact that the American system has a particular inertia.
When did he try? I'm unaware of these attempts. When did he do this?
All these are occurring in the background. So, for example, he would go and lean on people and say, okay, what we want to do is we want to move a removal of sanctions along. And then people will all look at him like he's a lunatic, and then this is a problem for him, right?
You said he's done it twice specifically before. So, like, who has he leaned on before? Or what has he leaned on before?
People in the State Department.
Okay, like, who, though? Is there any specific names?
Do you want me to name them?
Oh, well, maybe don't
to
name them, but give me like an article, like who's done the reporting on this or something. Put it in the side chat, and I'll leave it in the description.
Okay, yes, I will do that when I finish saying what I'm saying, because I have to actually go and get it now, because I just literally don't have it in front of me. Because again, from memory, another thing which is plainly obvious is Donald Trump's Iran stance. Donald Trump's stance on Iran is actually Donald Trump's stance on Iran is actually to the service of Russia, even though people don't seem to realize this for some reason. Hypothetically, yes, but I'll get to that.
All the European Union foes of the U.S. Like, that's wannabe dictator talk, in my opinion. But carry on.
Basically, his stance on Iran, which is that he would prefer to place sanctions back against Iran and repeal the JCPOA. This is a position which directly affects Russia in a positive way, because of the fact that repealing JCPOA and reimposing sanctions on Iran means that Iran will not be able to export its oil and gas to other countries unless those countries agree to ignore the sanctions that Trump would be imposing. This would mean that the European Union would become once again dependent on primarily Russian energy and would not be able to diversify with Iran in order to offset this. You would also end up with a problem where East Asian economies would essentially be forced to accept energy shortages for the sake of this policy. How is this not beneficial to Russia? Like which person would do that if they weren't attempting to deliberately benefit Russia? And the reason we know that
Okay,
this
hold
logic
on. Wait,
had
I'm gonna have
been,
to.
I have to finish this sentence.
Okay, we're finished.
The reason that this logic had been played out before is because in 2009, Zbigniew Brzezinski described exactly this scenario as the kind of scenario that is so dumb that Obama would obviously never do this because it would be beneficial to the Kremlin. Right? And yet, how strange that as soon as Trump gets into power, he does exactly that thing which the American establishment has said that you should not do, otherwise it would be beneficial to Russia.
Okay, so this is going to sound very bad, but my internet just cut out on me, and I'm literally going to have you repeat that whole thing because I literally cut out for the entirety of it. I am so sorry.
Okay, no problem. I'll go over it the second time. And so, okay.
I'm sorry for the people watching, by the way. I'm sorry I have shitty internet.
Yeah, basically, his position on Iran, which is to basically reimpose sanctions on Iran, essentially not honor the JCPOA and restrict oil and gas sales by Iran, would mean that the Europeans would become more dependent on Russia because of the fact that they would not be able to hedge against Russian political influence in Europe, which is mediated by oil and gas, by getting imports from Iran. That would not be able to happen.
Specifically Iran? Why not OPEC nations?
What? No, but Iran. No, the reason to bring Iran online for that oil and gas is because of the fact that that is closer to Europe. I mean, OPEC is already there, right? But I'm talking about the reason for bringing Iran in was precisely to create that kind of dynamic.
So another resource. Okay, I get you. Yeah,
putting it back outside just means that you're back with Russia again. The other reason is that you end up with the other logic is that you end up with an East Asian economy which is energy starved, and energy prices would obviously be going up as well, which would obviously be beneficial to Russia because Russia makes lots of money for its state coffers from the export of energy. You would have a situation in which Russia would become a mediator in the obvious conflicts which would occur as a consequence of this as well in the Middle Eastern region, because Russia's already present on the scene anyway, so why not? And you would also end up with a situation where the Kremlin would simply be cashing in and be able to export its agenda more because they'd be flush with cash and be able to do it. So this scenario was actually described before by Zbigniew Brzezinski in 2009 when he explained the number of things that Obama would not be doing because they would be silly things to do. So it's kind of interesting that Donald Trump then came in and did exactly those list of things which Zbigniew Brzezinski said would be silly things to do because they'd be beneficial to Russia.
It's also worth noting that the contacts between the Trump campaign, high-ups in the Trump campaign, when they were talking to Russian intelligence operatives and Russian officials and all the rest of that through back channels and those interesting things, Trump's immediately, his rhetoric turned around to be quite pro-Russian and all the rest of it. It's very telling. So all these things are starting to add up, and Mueller is tightening that rope around that orange fuck's fat neck. It really is glorious to see.
I'm so sure.
There's also the Maria Butina connection.
Well, no, if I may respond to that line briefly. First and foremost, things I think aren't mutually exclusive to interest. Like, I don't see why there are obvious actions that Trump has taken that, as a secondary consequence, could well benefit Russia. I don't deny that. But of course, this is at the same time one things the American public has asked for prior to Russia being involved. Like, these were things like, the Iran deal was hated by people on the right well before any Russian interference was needed. This isn't something that naturally needed to be interjected.
Indeed, but they would never have been able to actually express that opinion at a national policy level if it were not for the fact that Trump was installed to do precisely that thing.
Well, no, but if Trump wants to get elected in a democratic society, then he's going to have to appeal to some sort of foreign policy in order to get more people on his side.
Can you explain? No, let me say this.
Hold on, Hero.
Can you explain then why it is that Israeli intelligence and Russian intelligence had high-level contacts with the Trump campaign asking them to put forward precisely that specific policy? Because think about it this way. in a democratic society, you don't actually have to do what your constituents want in order to get elected. The reason we know this is because when Jeb Bush was running, who did he actually bring in as his advisor? And now you're going to tell me that the answer to
I
that
don't
question
know.
is Paul Wolfowitz. That is actually not true in the way that you think that it is. Paul Wolfowitz was brought on officially as Jeb Bush's go-to guy on foreign policy, but the person he was actually listening to was James Baker. Sometimes this happens where the person will appoint one policy advisor in order to appease the base and then not listen to that advisor and listen to a different one. So the GOP base and some of these Israeli lobbyists, as well as the Russian intelligence people, got wind of the fact that Jeb Bush was actually going to listen to James Baker, who was telling him actually that he should keep the Iran deal in place for precisely the reasons I just described. It was at that point that they then went to the base and told the base, oh, you need to be aware of these other candidates because they're not tough on this issue or whatever. Right? I don't think these things are coincidental. It didn't just so happen that Trump was the person who wanted to actually repeal the Iran deal, whereas people like Jeb Bush, for example, were pretending at the beginning that they wanted to repeal it and then were totally not going to do that.
Okay, so I want to add one more thing, two more things actually. First of all, when I'm done talking, I want Netzik to say what he was going to say because he was about to utter something, and then Ray went at it before he was able to even speak. So, yeah. Okay.
No, I was done. I very little to say. I was just feeding into it about the fuck. What was I gonna say? Shit, I'm still tired from last night. About yes, the high contacts between Russian intelligence and officials and all the rest of it, and then the policy change and all that, right? So it's very telling. And then of course you do have, and you'll push me to go into the topic about FISA abuse. I just want to say that those applications wonderfully destroy Trump Nunes fake news beautifully. If you look at the redacted codes, the redaction codes, the exemption codes, it shows multiple sources, confidential sources were used for different parts, littered throughout the entire damn thing. So anyone
what was this again? I'm sorry.
The FISA applications on Carter Page, because that, and then you're going to have the OIG report that comes out in a few months. Might even be next month, but I don't know. But whenever it comes out, that's going to be the final nail on the coffin. And Trump just attacking the intelligence community, the justice community,
for just merely investigating.
It's funny. It's interesting.
An innocent man is not going to demonize the people who are just trying to make sure he's not doing anything wrong, since he's basically.
Oh well, you have. This is such a dumb argument. It's like if you're not doing anything wrong, you shouldn't be worried. Because no, that's not the case. People looking into you when they're not supposed to be is not a good thing. It's not something you just sit there and take. If you're being wrongfully persecuted, if it's a waste of time and money.
Being persecuted.
I'll describe to you the things that he has done, and then you tell me whether you think these things deserve to be investigated or not. And this is going to be in detail here. So, okay, let's say that we go backwards to the year 2016. So we're talking like around June, July, and August of 2016. So I'm just going to describe this story to you. Okay, so apparently there are some Americans of Soviet extraction, such as Felix Sater and Michael Cohen, right? These people are related to Donald Trump because of the fact that obviously Cohen is Donald Trump's lawyer. Yes, all of these people are also connected to Chabad of Port Washington, which is a Jewish community center on Long Island, which is part of the worldwide Chabad movement, right? Mm-hmm. This movement has connections to Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin, as you obviously know. There was a BBC report saying that Cohen accepted $400,000 from the Ukrainian government to set up a meeting with Donald Trump last year. Okay? Sorry, not last year. Last year in the date of the thing that I'm looking at, which means that was actually in 2014 that this occurred. Then, in 2016, there was a New York Times report about a meeting in Trump Tower, which happened on the 3rd of August 2016, which happened after the one with the Kremlin operatives that was also discussed around that time that I don't need to elaborate on, in which Team Trump, along with George Nader, offered Donald Trump Jr. help getting his father elected, and Nader brought foreign aid to the Republican nominees' campaign, including from Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. But most key is that Nader brought with him that day a guy named Joel Zamel. who is an Israeli expert in things that are of interest to Team Trump, such as social media manipulation. Zamel possesses a close relationship with a bunch of former Israeli intelligence officials. Nader reportedly paid him a large sum, about $2 million, after Trump's election as compensation for Zamel's apparent help to elect the president in 2016, and then both of them visited the White House. Previously, Zamel was known to be the founder of something called Wikistrat, which is a private intelligence firm founded in 2010, which claims it has crowdsourced geopolitical analysis. It's based in Washington, D.C., but apparently Daily Beast uncovered that for all intents and purposes is, quote, an Israeli firm, and that the company's work was not limited to analysis, it is also engaged in intelligence collection. And for this reason, Wikistrat is under investigation by Mueller, whose investigators have interviewed Zamel, and FBI agents have traveled to Israel to dig deeper. Several prominent Wikistrat staffers formerly worked for Israeli intelligence, and some experienced espionage professionals in the USA's capital are wondering, obviously, if they still do.
Okay.
And I'm not even finished yet.
Okay, because I'm wondering if you want to if you want me to take this on a case-by-case bias, or just say no, this whole thing should be not investigated, or no, this whole thing should be investigated. Because I think there's a lot of individual things.
It's up to you how you would want to see it. And then, of course, obviously, just to speed this up, otherwise I would be here all day. These things obviously have the cross connections to Moscow that you've already talked about, and basically these people are together. And many of the people who are being referred to as basically sort of Russian operatives and so on happen to also sometimes be pulling double duty and are also simultaneously Israeli operatives. So I don't know, if you're Robert Mueller, would you not investigate all of the above?
Would I not invest? I'll tell you the one thing that really only genuinely sounded remotely suspicious there. The rest of that sounds like common backdoor politics to me. It doesn't seem like the only thing that sounded remotely suspicious, and the only thing that went in my mind, like the reason I looked at this, I was thinking like, well, if this were Hillary Clinton, would I want this investigated? And there's a lot of other stuff I'd have her investigated for. But if everything you just said to me about was applied to, say, Hillary Clinton, the only thing I think that might be worth looking into is like this Nader guy. Because other than that, like a lot of that was Israeli intelligence. You know, no matter which side of the political aisle you talk to, it's like, you know, Israel is our greatest ally, yada, yada, yada. Their intelligence is so inextricably linked with our own.
I do not believe it has ever been as profound as what is being described there, though.
Maybe not. A lot of these things are such backdoor operations that I can't imagine.
Inside of a campaign like that.
Let me ask you this, Pragmatic. If there was no collusion between the Trump campaign and Russian operatives or whatnot, then why did Donald Trump Jr., of all people, try to contact a Russian-abetted cyber terrorist organization to find dirt on Hillary Clinton?
Cyber terrorist organization. Well, last time I checked, they were the ones who reached out to him and said they had dirt. And then when he actually went to look on it, because why wouldn't you at least hear the people out who claim that they have some dirt on her? He said it was bogus and walked away from them. So I don't see how, you know, just somebody doing his due diligence. Like if Hillary Clinton had gone to, say, some Saudi Arabia and they said they had dirt on Donald Trump, well, I'm like, well, that's politics. I guess that's just how it is. Because, I mean, that's what it is. It's all these different operatives doing all this research on each other, backdoor and stuff.
How do you explain the conversation that Maria Butina had with Alexander Torshin on election night in 2016 as well, in which she basically went to him and said that, okay, she's basically accomplished her mission in the United States and that she is sleepy right now because it is 3 a.m., but she will be ready to accept more orders later.
Well, what was her role in it exactly? I've heard a little bit about her, but I haven't researched extensively.
Her role was to basically infiltrate the National Rifle Association by posing as a member of a non-existent Russian gun rights group for a non-existent concept, because Russia doesn't have a concept of gun rights in the first place, and to wend her way through the social network of the GOP, and then after she has done so, find ways to utilize the social network that she has mapped in order to create a back channel to Donald Trump from Vladimir Putin. Having accomplished this, she then reported back to Alexander Torshin on election night that she had accomplished her mission and that she would like some sleep now, and that any time that Alexander Torshin has more orders for her, he's free to contact her.
Okay, that sounds like a Russian spy doing their job. I won't deny that, but I don't see how that implies. If they were in direct contract with Trump, they wouldn't need to establish a back channel. They would just go out and tell him what to do, or somebody else would give him orders. There wouldn't need to be this massive runaround in order to.
Because he's a candidate at the time.
Exactly. You wouldn't be able to
Say
have
that
a
again.
front.
Sorry.
He's a candidate at the time. You wouldn't be able to have a front channel to the candidate because otherwise then he would be in big trouble. You have to do it by a back channel if you were going to do that, so that no one would find out that it was happening.
Well, why wouldn't he? If he was actually an agent of Russia, why wouldn't there already be pre-existing front channels? Why all this runaround just to get to him once he's actually been elected and like throughout this whole process?
This is all before the election.
Yeah, I'm talking
okay.
about, before the election.
Yeah,
No, go on.
Sorry,
2016, a bit of 2015. Yeah, all Trump talking to Russians and his campaign trying to set up back channels with them.
Well, does he know they're Russian, or does he think they're a part of the
But
National
again,
Rifle Association?
So Mueller has still got to get into Trump specifically and rip that fatso's ass apart. But
God, you really do want to work in some sort of deep state organization, don't you?
Oh, fucking hell, Jesus fucking Christ. But the point being is that I'll drop all bias the moment I enter those doors. But on the internet, fucking, he's my fucking little bitch. The point being, I forgot his name. God damn, fuck. Yeah, you can't do it, right? Because it's in violation. It could be in violation of the Logan Act, but also 18 USC, subsection 953, private correspondence with foreign governments.
Okay,
Yeah.
but does he
So-
know he's corresponding to foreign? The question isn't, does he know he's doing this, or is this
He
something
has
where he's
to know.
thinking through some other social? Well,
Wittingly or not.
Earlier, I said
And also,
earlier,
he has to know. No, hold on. I'm going to answer the question. He has to know that what he's doing is contacting Russians because of the fact that if you're creating a back channel with someone, you tell them who you're back channeling to. So of course he would have known.
well, they're creating a back channel
Well,
to him, but my question is, what's the confirmation that this back channel even worked? How do we know that Trump doesn't think he was just interacting with
It
the
doesn't matter
NRA or
because
some of these
It
proxy
doesn't even
groups
matter
that
because it can
supposedly,
be
it's supposed to be,
it can be indirect as well.
Yeah,
And
and
he
also,
said-
Butina would not have declared that she had accomplished what she set out to do if the back channel hadn't been established in the way described.
Yeah, and again, just to quote it's a sentence of it, but it's a very short thing. I linked it in the side chat. Any citizen of the United States, wherever he may be, who, without authority of the United States, directly or indirectly commences or carries on any correspondence or intercourse with a foreign government or any officer or agent thereof, with the intent to influence the measures or conduct of any foreign government or any officer of so on and so forth, right? So it can be indirect or direct.
Also,
Okay.
there are people in the chat who are asking how the Stormy Daniels issue has anything to do with.
I don't want to get into Stormy
with-
Daniels. Jeez.
I'm not interested in the. Hold on, I'm not interested in the actual affair or whatever it is. That's their problem, right? However, the thing which makes the Stormy Daniels thing interesting is because that's a lever to get into the other things. Why? Because Michael Cohen made a tape in which they recorded a tape in which they were having these conversations about these things. However, the process of that having been a thing that happened means that you can then pivot out of that context and into the context of the 20 other tapes, which apparently Michael Cohen has, and then you can begin to unravel the other things from there. So the Stormy Daniels thing is not actually relevant in and of itself, but it's basically a pathway which Robert Mueller can use to pivot into other things.
It's also worth noting that
Potentially.
apparently, it's also worth noting that in transcripts, the lawyers for Trump, so they'll always meet with Trump in pairs, right? Because the fucker would lie, and they wanted to make sure that it was to account and they'd always write notes of what he said in case he tries to backpedal. So even his lawyers, because they recorded him, but they'll meet in pairs of two to make sure that he doesn't lie about what he said to the other person.
I'd like to see your source on that, just because I'm not exactly sure where it comes from. But
that was a transcript from one of the hearings, I think it was.
yeah, I will bring something up I said earlier that I've been trying to bring up. Is as I said,
yeah, sorry, go on, Nero. Sorry, we've been ignoring you.
Trump has had contact with the KGB back in the 1980s, so it wouldn't surprise me if he's been working with Russian intelligence for probably even before 2015. He's been in contact with
The year
Russian.
that they talk about is 1987, by the way.
1987. Yeah, I apologize for saying 1983.
Yeah, no. Well, I mean,
And it's
obviously,
not,
as a
and it's also
business,
specified as a different word for this as well. There are some people who are using the word agent. That is the incorrect word. From 1987, Trump would be considered to be a Russian person of interest or a Russian asset, but not an agent. These are two separate things. Agent implies that he is consciously and deliberately working on behalf of the organization and is paid by them. Whereas being an asset or a person of interest means that he's still acting on his own time. It's just that he is willingly engaged in a dialogue back and forth with them. So these things are slightly different.
yeah. Now, what I would say is Trump is a businessman. Trump has to do business through what is the authority in the Soviet Union and most of Russia at that time, which really is the KGB. Like, this goes back to things like when he's building stuff. Obviously, you go through the back channels in Russia, which are the KGB, essentially. And so as a businessman, if he's doing these things, I can't particularly see how him having a business relation in Russia in years past is necessarily going to influence his future presidency, as he's not, he's cut off from his funds at this point.
Well, one way to highlight the difference is to compare other people who did that exact same thing, and then you can see there's an actual difference between the people who did not become assets versus the people who did. The people who
none of them were positioning to run for president at any point other in their career.
No. I mean political people. So, for example, the Koch brothers, for example, were interacting with Russia, but they never became assets. And the way that you can actually determine this is when you compare the two of them to each other. The Koch brothers never actually started advocating openly pro-Russian positions or Kremlin positions that had been effectively hold on. That had been stenographed by the KGB at the time. So at the time, Trump came out and was writing stuff in newspapers about like Soviet American collaboration and stuff like this. Why would he do that if he weren't functioning as an asset of them?
So he could make more money for himself.
Was that all really about business? Because technically he didn't need to essentially throw himself on the floor to get that stuff to happen.
No, he didn't, but I'm sure it would have built his buildings.
Why would he need to go that distance? And also, he has some strange ideological statements that he purported to have made at that time as well, such as the one where he claimed that the best way to put the third world in check would be to have America and Russia on the same side. A person who is strictly in it for business is not going to come up with such an ideological, racially tinged statement about interacting with Russia. He'd just be there for the business, right?
Again,
so that suggests asset to me.
I am definitely going to have to look into this further, as again, I'm not an expert in this field, but I imagine there is other context to those things as well. But initially, to the point of why is he espousing some sort of hold on. Let me just finish this point real quick. Okay. To the point of why is he suddenly advocating positions that the Russians might have been into or something along that line? Again, we run into the issue of determining whether something is a position, that's implanted by the Kremlin or whether the Kremlin is taking advantage of a position that, is simply already within America and they're just taking advantage of it, or whether it's really genuinely just an American position and it just happens to align with Russia and these things just happened organically. Because we have to understand that the sentiments that Trump has been pushing for aren't uniquely him necessarily. They're pre him. They're almost Buchananite and Paleocon in some of their tenor. And, unless you're going to tell me that there's some relation with Russia to him, I mean, I'd be very interested.
Not to Buchanan, but to certain Christian fundamentalists. For example, you see in the indictment that they brought against Maria Butina, there's a person 1 and a person 2. Person 1 is a guy named Erickson, so I don't have to cover him. And person 2 is a guy named, I'm going to have to use my memory, his name is something Clay or something like this, and it turns out that he is a Christian fundamentalist with particularly, I guess, protectionist values and all that stuff that goes along with it. And he is the guy who wants to also create a back channel. So it's almost like there are multiple people trying to create back channels at the same time. And this guy was essentially the link for the Christian fundamentalist section of these collaborators who had this vision that somehow American evangelicalism, having lost the culture war in the United States, would need to get support from abroad from the Russian Orthodox Church in order to repropagate conservatism in the United States. That was the position they held.
Is this that guy who wrote the book, The Family?
No.
No, different guy. Okay.
No.
I was just wondering because it sounded very familiar.
No, what I'm talking... Well, this same individual described that scenario. That individual described that scenario, but what I'm talking about is an actual person who was trying to create a back channel to Donald Trump, who was one of the American evangelicals. and there is a link between these groups as well. So when you say that
No,
somehow,
well, this goes back
when
to
you say that somehow
Russia
there's an
being linked to
organic,
the general right.
yes, and so if the right wing in the United States believes that in order to be successful, they have to become traitors and become willing assets of the Russian government, I don't see how that's exculpatory for them.
Well, I don't think they're becoming traitors. I think that obviously they see some sort of cultural alliance with Russia, but I don't think that's equivalent to treachery. I think there's a lot of
How is
places.
that not treason? Okay, let me do an equivalent comparison. Let me do an equivalent comparison. Imagine that, let's say that I'm sitting here in Europe, for example, and let's say that for some reason I decide that I'm going to reach out to China and deliberately take on positions that are beneficial to China, and then deliberately have them stenographize my positions, and then I become political while I'm doing that. Would it not be reasonable to say that some sort of treason is going on there if I deliberately make myself available to serve a foreign power?
Well, deliberately serve a foreign power, how is the key thing? Because, again, if interests just happen to co-align and you decide, well, you people share my interests, so I'll take money from you so I can propagate our mutually shared interests in my home country. And that's
how is that not treason under normal circumstances?
It's not treason. That's just democracy. When you take money from lobbyists and say, "Hey, I'm going to go support this value," that's like
No,
what
but
American. That's the American plutocracy.
No, but in the United States, it is not legal to take money from outside sources in that way. They have specifically said you're not allowed to do that.
But nations with foreign governments of that nature are completely illegal.
Yeah, everyone has to play by when you're lobbying, you have to play by a very specific set of rules. So, for example, let's say I'm lobbying for Japan. I can't just literally take money and move it from one place to another.
No, I get that, but let's stop playing with the formalities here and act like countries don't form shell corporations or form shell charities and things like this to donate monies through other channels already. Like every other country is already doing this. The fact that Russia is now engaging in it and they happen to be supporting the right isn't some massive revelation in my mind or equivalent to treason. Either.
No, why would you be surprised then that that would be investigated if you have a geostrategic adversary that's engaging in these activities?
Before going to Prague, do you have someone else that can join with you on your side?
I've been looking for a while, but it appears as though all my allies are sort of
offline.
Offline, yes, and I'll admit, foreign policy is the one in which I am certainly most least prepared to engage in the debate.
That's right. Let's shift it off then, because you do keep mentioning like a deep state. And I'm not sure if you're meaning or if you're serious.
Well, no. Well, I was going to tell you in the side chat, but it's been something I've believed in for a while, since well before Trump. But it's certainly I believe it's not a question about whether or not it exists. I think it's a question of what its interests are, and I just think their interests are inherently anti-American.
Well, let's go about that then, because you do seem to be more best prepared for that one instead of the foreign policy aspect, which you're getting ganged and raped on. The well, I mean, in terms of
no, I get it. It's fine.
I mean, yes. So you think the deep states are to get Trump, or so you think the whole FISA applications, the NSA, CIA, FBI, and all that's out to get him, or?
I think it's become specifically him. I don't think it's always been him. I think it's been people who have otherwise supported a more populist, nativist American sentiment that they've sort of been trying to put down. And so Trump's just happens to be the most recent incarnation of it. And I think it's been easier to identify issues that they've been having with him. And
but to be fair, there is evidence to suggest that Russia also worked with the Bernie Sanders campaign.
That's off it though, because we're facing away from that and more onto the deep state aspect, as if it's to get Trump. So I mean, one of the things the OIG report found about the interference in 2016, or how they investigated into that with the Clinton emails and all that, showed that the New York field office for the FBI actually is at the most senior levels had a very deep hatred and grudge against Clinton, and that was revealed in the OIG report in a conversation between Comey and who was it? Rice? No, someone else, some woman. I forgot who it was, and they were concerned about it. That's the only actual confirmed bias their OIG report found.
Well, then there's Strzok and this whole ordeal now.
I want to address this because I don't think I stayed towards the full thing. I've watched significant amounts of that hearing. Strzok destroyed, intellectually ruined the GOP scum in that hearing.
Not at all. Not even close.
He destroyed those conservative.
No, it was a
cucks.
bunch of semantic dancing around the actual questions.
No, he actually answered and destroyed. But the point being, so if you read all the texts, I read all of them. So I can officially confirm here right now, as well as anyone who's actually read all of them, right? They downloaded the whole fucking file from one of the senators, they kicked off the whole fucking shit show. Read all of them. Lisa Page said she would vote for Trump, right? That's one. Two, both of them bashed on Clinton, Obama, his attorney general pick, and Bernie Sanders, Jill Stein. They bashed on
but the context is
candidate.
Okay, sure. But then they went on to say, we're going to stop him from winning. What's all that about exactly?
Well, as you should have heard in the hearing, he just said he was referring to the people of America. And that was in response to when he was basically shitting on a serviceman, but don't know what unit of his army, what branch, and all the rest of it. But that died apparently, and he was apparently taking shit on him. Also, that's the feeling that Strzok got from it. So he's thinking that the people of America would not vote for such an incompetent, disgusting, orange fat fuck. That's what he was thinking.
This I don't know if you're reading into it there, but that seems like a heavy amount of bias against Trump.
That's what his response was.
Okay, so that seems like a that's
about it. That's his response.
What was the question I would want to ask is, given everything that we know anyway, or given everything that was known at that point, why would you not expect the incumbents or people who are inside the intelligence community to be, quote, biased against Trump at that point anyway? It's a warranted bias if such a bias existed, which it didn't, but it should have existed.
I would argue A, it did. B, why should it have existed? Why should they be biased against him?
Because he's going against the positions which they have held on foreign policy.
They're not supposed to hold foreign policy positions. They're supposed to be protecting this country through their information.
Yes, in their position and their jobs in the workspace, yes. But again, this is private correspondence we're talking about here. That's fine. The First Amendment protects these guys on the ground. Private correspondence. And the reason why you know about them is because they're sadly using FBI phones, right? So apart from that, this is private correspondence. And again, the OIG report concluded that there was no bias that impacted the investigation.
Let's talk about the bashing they did real quick, because I get this a lot. Like, ex-comedian bashes the left and the right, and they give you these examples of like Trevor Noah or some leftoid pundit is making some really shallow joke about Hillary being out of touch. And then the next joke about the right wing is something about how like they're vicious, evil people who want to like suck the blood out of the lower class or something. And it's like, yeah, they're bashing both of them, but at the same time, it's jokes of a different caliber. Like people bashing Obama or Hillary, that's one thing. But then like the specifics you just pointed out about Trump were clearly very, very hateful. So what exactly what was comparable about the Obama and Hillary bashing that leads you to believe it's equally biased?
So they'd bash on about how that she had so much media bias in her favor. They ripped on her daughter, Chelsea, I think her name is, I forgot. They ripped on, I think it was Eric Holden, or I forgot who it was, one of his AGs. But they ripped on him for his stance. He was going on TV for something and making an announcement of some sort. They bashed on pretty much all of them equally. One of them said to the other, I forgot who was who, but they asked who were they voting for, and it's not when they said that they were voting for Trump. I think that was Lisa Page. And of course, Lisa Page said that she was actually afraid of the Clinton presidency. Let's keep that in mind. But also that when they were guessing about who they were going to go for, one of them made a guess and was shocked at the other's answer, because the answer the other person gave was quite a far-leaning Republican. It wasn't Trump, of course. It was some other candidate. And they were surprised. They thought they were going to go for a person who's on the left. Again, I forgot
Ted Cruz?
I think they said that they were actually shocked about someone. I was aware of it because of pawn all the things on Twitter or Matt Tate, and then I downloaded the file and I saw the text for myself. And so they were both leaning Republican in terms of their actual votes. Once they were actually vote for Trump and that they were afraid of a Clinton presidency, the other person said that they were going to vote for another Republican, and the other one was surprised at their response.
So then where does I'm still not getting the context of where the Trump thing comes out of. Is it just because they think he's too radical of a right-winger?
Trump, yes, because if you look at his rhetoric, I mean, as outlined in the hearing, but of course, if you're paying attention, you were, in 2016, his rhetoric was pretty fucked up. You know, saying shit like he would return to waterboarding, even though, I'll say it here and now, hold on, Ray, hold on. Even though the enhanced interrogation techniques of the CIA did empirically work, and the minority views of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence Study does reflect exactly that, still going back to where it was fucked, right? Saying he would, although he was target the family
so you
terrorists.
like the interrogation method that he advocated for, but you're mad that he advocated for it?
No, so I'm saying that as a matter of historical fact, it did produce results. It did, right? But naturally, the reason why they were doing it in the first place, and this is going a little bit off topic, but the reason why they do it in the first place is to develop the intelligence, the networks, and paint the picture of who the fuck they're dealing with, Al-Qaeda and all the rest of it, right? Because they're coming into it pretty much blind. And the EITs naturally wound down as they developed more in terms of connections, who's who, who's what, all that, and developed more signals intelligence to target these people, right? So it naturally wound down. But just for the fact of historical record, it did fucking work. Did produce a lot of actionable intelligence, all the rest of it. See the SSCI's
I wouldn't disagree with you there. I'm actually on board with you there.
Yeah, exactly. So the point being is that Trump still said that he'd bring it back, right? And that got his backlash. He'd say that he'd also get the families of terrorists. I would disagree with that. These would elicit responses from people. And of course, in the private correspondence, I guarantee 2016, every single person in the Strzok hearing, if you could, FOIA, you can't though, but say if you could, or leaked, FOIA or leaked all their communications, texts, emails, the rest of it in 2016. They would have been bashing on each other, but notably would have been bashing on Trump because he said the most, even if you agree with him, he said the most bombastic things. Right?
Yes, that's what I was going to say as well.
So even if you agree with him, he was out there. He was saying ludicrous stuff. Even if you agree with him, he was bombastic. You can't deny it.
And the other thing about enhanced interrogation is that if you're going to do enhanced interrogation, you should not run on enhanced interrogation because you're just asking for backlash at that point. It'd be almost like if Gordon Brown had got up and decided that he was going to run for election on the standpoint of, we're going to take terrorists, put black bags over their heads and throw them into a black van. Then we're going to take them to an airport. We're going to fly them to Libya, and then we're going to rip out their fingernails once they get there. Elect me now. Obviously, you don't literally run on that, even though you're going to do that, and that's in fact what they did do.
Damn, that's pretty metal. Okay. So I can see the case you're making here, whereas Trump is the most bombastic, undeniably so. And as such, he's just prone to a little more flack than any other candidate in particular. A reasonable case, one I can get. I'm still going to suspend belief because I believe there were further actions taken at this point. And I'm sorry to cut it off right now, but I'll look more into this, and hopefully when we negotiate a part 4 sometime, we can get back to this issue as well.
I still do have one question before we curtail though, which is, how did you react to the Helsinki meeting when Trump basically went there, sat down and looked like a little boy in front of Trump at the in front of Putin at the beginning, and then they went into the room and they had the quote private conversation with only the translator present, and then Trump came out looking kind of weird with Putin walking behind him with the man walk, and then they came and stood in front of the podium. They said some amazing things in which Putin was very organized because he had gone in there with a notepad and taken notes and apparently gotten some forms of concessions from Trump that we're unaware of. And then Trump essentially talked about stuff that didn't make any sense for a while, and then Putin spoke, and then they went to the media, and the media asked him a bunch of questions, and then Vladimir Putin admitted quite frankly, that yes, he did want Donald Trump to win the election, and yes, he did direct his people to support that end. And then they edited that out of the transcript, even though it's literally there on the transmission.
Wait, who edited it? Who edited it exactly? Was it the Russians or the Americans or who?
Oh, both. Oh, both. If you look at the news services such as CNN, MSNBC, BBC, or any of them that have footage of the event as it occurred, there's the line where where I think it's Jim Acosta is asking whether Putin supported and directed his people to support Trump in the 2016 election. There are two different edits that have taken place as of 2 days ago, and the edit on the American side, if you go to whitehouse.gov, you'll see the transcript is missing the top part of Jim Acosta's question, so that it seems to flow on from the previous question, so that when Putin responds, yes, I did, it no longer has the same meaning.
Okay.
And you're thinking, okay, well, maybe that's just a line that's missing from the transcript. No, because if you actually look at the video that the whitehouse.gov have posted up, you can actually see that they have cut the video at that specific point so that that question does not appear to have been asked. Then, if you go to the Russian Federation's website on the same issue, and you look for that portion of the video where Jim Acosta asked that question, Trump looks uncomfortable, and then Putin gives a straight answer, right? That does not exist on the Kremlin's version of events at all. In fact, Jim Acosta, I'm thinking it's Jim Acosta that asked the question, so someone can correct me if it's not actually him, right? But that question does not appear at all. And so the video, and then if you check the video just cuts as though that question was never asked. Does that not look suspicious to you? What did you think of that?
Well, no, I don't know why they would cut it, because I think it's perfectly...
They had this meeting in private, and we still don't know what was said.
The private meeting, I don't think, is a huge deal. I think world leaders discussing events that, the public might not need to hear is, that's just politics, whether or not I like it. I do think it's odd that that portion is cut. And I think it shouldn't be cut, because I don't think it's a big secret that people, that Russia would want Trump to win. Like, I don't think that's something that's... I don't think that's something that's worth cutting even. I think you're right. It just makes it look worse than it is, because Russia having a candidate whom they favor, I don't think is a crime. Nor do I think it's wrong, because every country obviously has a leader they think is going to be better suit their own national interests.
I think the thing that they were really spooked by was the fact that the question included the line, "Did you direct your people to support him?"
Yeah, no,
so
I
when,
think the fact that they cut it out is
Putin
dumb.
responded, "Yes, I did," twice, that meant he was assenting both to the fact that he wanted Trump to win and that he directed his people to support them. And so the fact that both of the White House and the Kremlin have cut this out of their version of events is an indication that something is wrong here. Is that not so?
Something's being hidden, yes. But I do want to say one thing before we end this stream that we could bring up in part 4, especially if Natsik joins us and he isn't tired like he was today, obviously. I actually wanted to bring up the fact that it wasn't just a Trump campaign in Russia, but I think there's also evidence out there to suggest that the Bernie Sanders campaign colluded with Russia. I mean, that's been implied from what I understand of the recent Michael Cohen emails. Michael Cohen contacted one of the managers of the Bernie Sanders campaign, and obviously Russia would prefer Bernie Sanders to win over Hillary Clinton.
That wasn't Cohen. It wasn't Cohen, it was Manafort.
Okay, my bad. But anyway, obviously Bernie Sanders to the Russians would be better than Hillary Clinton, since Bernie Sanders' foreign policy is inspired by an old coot named Noam Chomsky, who believes the U.S. is the world's most evil superpower and must be stopped at all costs. So,
yeah, no, that wouldn't surprise me there. Am I echoing? Who's echoing?
Maybe next time, if Natsik can join us, we can also discuss to what extent did the Bernie Sanders campaign collude with Russia, because we're not trying to blame the entire right for interference in the 2016 election, because there's also a huge problem among the Democratic Party of a certain radical segment of the party trying to overthrow the moderates, and that in turn would also benefit Russia, in my opinion. The Bernie Sanders section of the Democratic Party becoming the dominant force within that party would benefit Russia to a large extent, in my opinion. So,
I am reluctant, and I'm going to put this on the record. I am reluctant to say that that there's an entire section of the Democratic Party that is problematic. Perhaps Bernie Sanders himself is problematic, but I don't see a problem necessarily with the rest of them. In fact, they could actually be leveraged against this Russia business, because if you think about it, and I mean, Pragmatic effectively concurred with it anyway when I suggested it. You all are in a situation where the United States is presently being run by a government which acknowledges that the only way to push through tax cuts, social conservatism, and tariffs is to collaborate with a foreign power in order to do so. So I'm sure that people on the far left could make the argument that so committed are these guys to American plutocracy that they'll even now support people from outside of the US to prop it up. Because that's what they're doing. That's what they're doing, right?
The problem with like the establishment, quote, both left and right, effectively being a uniparty, is that in their little differences that they have, one side always has a stake in it, and it's always going to be propped up by one nation or another. You know, if you happen to like one more than the other, then that's a personal taste kind of thing, depending on where your ideology lies. And I mean, you know, if Russia's pushing a socially conservative narrative in America, then I don't happen to mind it because I like socially conservative values. And so there we go. But again, I can understand why people...
You can see how that's going to be very easy then, if the left were to actually capitalize on that properly, to be able to say that, okay, it means that you love social conservatism so much that you're willing to actually betray the American flag in order to do so. Whereas Democrats could simply say, well, we're not collaborating with any foreign power.
I don't think that's true, because it's collaboration with a foreign power in what sense? Because social conservatism isn't anti-American. There's nothing about what the current administration is advocating.
Indeed, but that's exactly the point then, because it means that you guys believe that you can't actually get social conservative victories on your own, which is why you had to sell out the country in order to get them. That would
what are we selling out? What have we sold out here? I'm not quite getting that we've done something wrong exactly.
Because I'd say that if I were the Democratic frontrunner, I'd be on television constantly repeating this talking point that basically, okay, so unpopular are they that they couldn't actually win it with the American flag. They had to go and essentially get rented support from an outside power in order to impose themselves.
Well, you could easily come back with the same thing about any Democratic politician. It's just a different set of countries doing it.
Okay, and who would those be?
I look at OPEC nations mainly. I think of the deal done for uranium with who did Clinton sell the uranium, or who did the Clinton State Department sell uranium to? Uranium fields to. I forget exactly who it was, but there was a nation there. There was, of course, funds taken from Libya, and then some deal made where certain prisoners were let go. So it's a coalition of different nations.
No, we're talking about people. We're talking about being propped up by a particular individual by having that person, by having that country.
I thought we were talking about being propped up by a nation.
That's what I just said. At least I think I just said that. I meant to say nation if I didn't just say that.
Okay.
So yes, if we're talking about nations, I'm talking about in the electoral process having a specific country intervene in order to assist you in that process.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think the Democrats have ever have at least in this cycle or in a previous cycle, have sat down and been like, you know what, we're just gonna invite China to prop up our electoral success because we're unable to actually win on our own.
I would not put it past him. I think you have far too much faith in either party. I've been
asked by pseudo-analysts in the chat, didn't Corbyn like Venezuela? Was Corbyn colluding with Chavez? The answer to that question is actually yes.
Okay, but
what is he expect me to say?
Yes, it is true that all nation states, in essence, at least the ones who can actually exert influence, do try to interfere in other people's elections because it's in their national interest. Well, the thing is, that doesn't mean the countries doing so can't push back against other people interfering in their affairs. I mean, listen, we need espionage. For instance,
no, I'm not disagreeing with that sentiment that we shouldn't push back.
I mean, yes, it's a double standard, but the CIA has it's a useful asset for espionage. It's naive to say that America shouldn't have espionage. We shouldn't have spies.
I wouldn't say that we don't have. Yeah, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have spies. I would make the case that we can have spies that aren't simultaneously spying on other countries, but at the same time subverting American interests as well, which I think is what the CIA has been actively doing for several decades at this point. And so my big point is that I'm all for, if America wants to become an independent nation again and not just a big corporate state that's bought off by various interests, I'm open to that at any point in time. My point is that it's not doing that. It really has no plans on doing that. At least the Uniparty isn't at any time soon.
Okay,
And
so I'll put to you this question then, because I can see where you're going with this. I'll put to you this question. If you're saying that basically everything is all made equal anyway, because this is totally above board and you just might as well do it. What would you say then if, say, a coalition of countries, let's say the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, and hypothetically Japan, for example, Netherlands, United Kingdom, Japan, let's say these three countries got together, with Australia perhaps, and decided, okay, since you guys are okay with Russian intervention in elections, why don't we just have the opposite of that in also intervening on the side of the other party? In which case then the United States then becomes almost a free-for-all playing field in which everyone's intelligence operatives are able to manipulate your elections.
Implying it isn't already.
Well, I mean, let's hypothetically say that it's formally banned at the moment, even though some people may or may not have done this before. But I mean, since we're at the point where if they declare that this is just open season, then why even bother concealing it at this point? I mean, we could just literally run a British candidate for American presidency next time around from the Democrats or something, and just be like, well, you're doing it with Russia.
Well, no, if that's the next phase of American democracy, as much as I dislike democracy anyway. But if this is the next phase of American democracy where we're essentially being bought off by foreign nations, then I don't have an opinion on it. I think it's just, well, that's that. I'd be very apathetic to it, I guess.
And also, which one? When people talk about the quote deep state, quote unquote, which they refer to when they're talking about the North Atlantic powers, which is basically a NATO thing, which they see as being not based in any one specific nation, but somehow hovering in the Atlantic somewhere. In terms of legitimacy, which one do you think is more legitimate anyway? Hypothetically, if the United Kingdom intervened in American elections, these are at least the same people. Whereas in the case of Russia, what is that?
What do you are you saying? Like the same cultural people? What are you saying?
I'm not the same cultural people. So I mean, technically, you would notice it less if the United Kingdom intervened in American elections. Hypothetically, because I'm not saying that the United Kingdom has ever done so, but hypothetically, if it occurred, why would you be against that but in favor of Russia?
Because I like Russia's policies more than I like England's at this point. I mean,
well, at least you're not denying it.
No, I mean, I'm not.
Hold on, so you like the slaughtering of innocent civilians in Syria? Because that's basically what the Russians are doing.
Are you talking about? What are you talking about specifically? Like gas attacks, barrel bombs, or what?
Well, that's not done by the Russians. That's done by the regime. But the regime is being helped up by the Russians. But particularly focused on the Russian forces themselves are slaughtering innocent civilians.
I mean, I think we had a conversation about collateral before, and in the fight. I mean, in the fight to fight what is essentially the radical jihadism that the rebels, quote unquote, have aligned themselves with. I don't, again, it's collateral. It's unfortunate, but that's war.
But there's a difference between.
What about the occupation of Crimea? What value in that you see as acceptable?
Finish what I'm going to say. There's a difference between targeting enemies of the Syrian government and indiscriminately bombing civilian targets. Like, they've been caught bombing hospitals that have not been demonstrated.
Is this the last hospital? Is this the last hospital in Aleppo finally being destroyed? Is that the case?
Well, it's already been destroyed.
The point I'm trying to make, though, is that Russia is contributing to.
You need to be careful.
The Syrian government is using terror tactics to make sure that the Syrian civil war goes the way it wants to. They're not using proportionality. They're not respecting international humanitarian law. They're saying, fuck it, we're going to indiscriminately bomb our civilians and the Russians will help us. So if you're a fan of refugee crises, because Assad caused the Syrian civil war, there's no other way around it. He's the one who caused
No, he didn't. An influx of migrants after Gaddafi was taken down caused it, and then they started protesting and demanding rights that they didn't really need. And so,
the Syrian civil war is the result of Assad foolishly thinking he can just open fire on a wave of peaceful protesters.
Peaceful protesters, large quotations there.
Yeah, well,
large quotations. They were peaceful, obviously.
No chanting and all the rest of it, no gunshots happened until one bloke set fire into himself in protest. Then the police forces and whatnot started opening up on the crowds, and that kicked the whole fucking thing off.
I've seen a lot of footage. There might not have been guns present, but it certainly wasn't. This wasn't a Kent State type innocent incident. I should say this wasn't like this. This is more along the lines of like the American soldiers in Boston Harbor throwing snowballs at the British soldiers in case
They
they
weren't doing. They
robbed.
were just chanting and in a massive, big fucking crowds, holding up everything. That was all they were doing.
Yeah, but even then,
There is an extent to which Assad made a serious mistake on that day, because, as you know, during that time, Syria was opening up internet connectivity for its citizens, just at the very time when the whole Arab Spring also happened to be happening, and so you ended up with a situation in which people who were relatively new to smartphones and relatively new to the whole social media sphere were being whipped up into a rage over various things, particularly from regions of Syria that have been more associated with social conservatism than the other regions before. And so the rebels were in fact from socially conservative regions. But this is Assad's mistake. Assad's mistake is that he did not swiftly install on the correct timescale the kind of equipment for deep packet inspection and so on that would be needed for properly doing geospatial intelligence. If he had done geospatial intelligence, he could have actually put a stop to all of this before it ever became a march in a city that could have had people shooting at other people in that city.
Well, yeah. Well, I do find it quite interesting that at the same time as you pointed out, that the internet was opening up in Syria, all these Syrians, quote unquote, started protesting, and they just happened to be in the right position to agitate. And then there was some sort of action taken against them right as they were getting the ability to learn that smartphone stuff. It's quite a coincidence indeed.
Blame would still be on Assad though, because
why?
If Black Lives Matter. When Black Lives Matter ever protests something, they always riot. Okay, there's always a riot whenever these radical leftist protesters come out.
Mm-hmm.
But you know what? The police don't just open fire at them. They don't use actual bullets to kill them.
You're talking to the wrong person, because I'm a firm believer that they should be doing just that.
It doesn't matter what you think, because in the end, if the police actually killed these protesters, then it
who are destroying property and causing millions of dollars of damage.
Yeah, but the kind of thing that would happen afterwards, spiraling.
You don't kill them.
Yeah,
Why
not?
The kind of spiraling problem that results from that would make it worse.
Yeah, you could possibly get a breakout of insurgency. Congratulations, that's the last thing you want. So the point being is where you could. Yeah.
All right, if you're going to make the case that Assad made a strategic mistake in opening up fire, I can concede that, but I don't think it's in the morally wrong, is what I would still say.
The thing is that Russians are helping them out. They're not helping them even target specifically ISIS or anything like that. The Russians are directly helping them.
Well, they're helping them in both the civil war and with ISIS. I think it's obviously, Syria is the ally for them.
Yes, but even Russia's not very good at targeting ISIS. It's mostly the international coalition that's getting most of the fucking ISIS kills.
Yeah, but also the CSIS.
Well, yeah, a coalition of nations is going to do better than a single nation. That's not surprising to me.
No, but you're missing his point, though. The CSIS, the Center for International Strategy and Studies, I completely butchered that acronym.
Strategic International Studies.
Yeah, they did a study that showed that this was back in 2015, so it's kind of outdated, I suppose, but I think it's still true today, where instead of targeting ISIS, they're more inclined to bomb the people who are in direct opposition to Assad rather than just ISIS. They focus more on non-ISIS targets.
Yeah.
And that's because, as NatSec will conclude, they're trying to get rid of the people who are trying to overthrow their marionette over there in Syria. They're not they don't give a shit about ISIS.
If Israel was going through a civil war and the opposition was vehemently anti-American, would we not aid the rightful Israeli government that was friendly to our position in maintaining power?
Would we indiscriminately bomb civilians while doing so? No, of course not.
I don't know. Let's ask the people of My Lai what we do with civilians.
The people of who?
They have. Are you unfamiliar with the My Lai massacre in of Vietnam?
Oh no,
That was an isolated incident.
a corrupt general. You can't generalize an entire army for the actions of a corrupt general. That guy was prosecuted, wasn't he?
Yeah. The point being is that the buck stops to the person who was aware of the incident and didn't do anything about it or gave the director or anything like that. So, for example, when it comes to the civilian shooting of the aircraft, Malaysian air flights, I forgot the number, over Russia/Ukraine, that was ordered by the higher ups of the government.
Yeah, that was definitely Russian. I'm not disagreeing with you there.
Possibly Putin, right? And of course, the agencies cover it up. So in that regard,
MH7.
incident, that's the one, yeah. In that incident, you could paint the actual government and military as the issue because it's both cover up of it by its intelligence services and, of course, very high authority approving it. But in this case, in that incident, or even the Kandahar, I forgot what it was. It was in Afghanistan. I think it was called the Kandahar massacre. But I forgot, where a soldier snapped and killed 17 civilians in the middle of the night up a mountain or something like that. The buck stops at him. So it's about command responsibility, right, and differentiating between the different levels and again where the buck responsibility stops.
Not to mention that was like 40, 50 years ago. So it's
Well,
sort of
the one
irrelevant to bring up
yes.
something.
The point being,
America has
no,
changed. America has
well,
changed.
it's not even that. This was an isolated incident on an individual, and he was prosecuted for it. That's always
Well, I mean,
the case.
there was also the use of Agent Orange as well.
Agent Orange wasn't a war crime and not a legal issue because it was used as a defoliant. It wasn't used to target farms or the population or insurgents or anything like that. And
there's some incidents that make that questionable, but
not at all. The reason why it was giving out more deadly effects than what was known was because of an impurity, a certain dioxin. And that was the impurity was the result of the manufacturing process. It wasn't intended. It was only used as a defoliant, so the forces could operate in dense jungles.
Okay, I can grant that there might have been some things wrong with it, but I still think there are some specific specific incidences that indicate that the U.S. government was using on more than just defoliation and such. But we've been going for over.
That's what the Russians are doing now, or what Assad and the Russians in general are doing now in Syria. You can't compare the two. You can't compare what Russia and Assad.
I don't know why we got focused on Syria in the first place. I mean, you could have just done Ukraine and Crimea and had enough to go on with. Like, which part of that? Yeah, which part of that is okay, in your view?
Oh no, none of it. I'm Ukrainian. I hate the fact that they're in fucking Ukraine right now. Okay. But they're not.
That's interesting then. So then, how can you be on their side?
Because Russia isn't fighting to take control of Syria. They're fighting to reinstall the rightful government of it.
No. I'm talking about Ukraine specifically. I mean, how can you be on their side in the case of collaborating with them in an American context if you know these are the same people who are trying to occupy parts of Ukraine, are already inside of Crimea, and attempted to have a coup in Montenegro?
I don't know much about the Montenegro incidents, but I don't take, governments aren't monoliths and the people that make up them aren't monoliths. I take the actions that I like and I take...
But there's nothing that happens in Russia at this point due to the vertical of power. It doesn't actually pass across Vladimir Putin's desk. So it's not like you can do a deal with Vladimir Putin in which somehow he's going to not continue to do these other things that you're talking about.
Vladimir Putin is... it's funny because the History Channel just did a special on him, and it talks about how he rose through certain channels of power to get where he is. And the thing is, those channels of power are still very much in play. I'm not saying Putin isn't obviously the de facto dictator of Russia, but it's not like there aren't other people like him playing their own game and manipulating the system right now, like he did.
Indeed, but which one of them are okay? None of them appear to be okay. And if you look at Georgia and the situation with Abkhazia as well, you can actually see that whole apparatus in play, because Abkhazia became essentially just an occupied territory of the FSB specifically, and you can see all of the corruption on display in that one location. It's almost like a microcosm of the whole thing. So I don't understand like how people on the right in the US could look at this and be like, you know what, it'd be a great idea to just collaborate with these people. Why would you do that?
It's become a lesser of two evils type of situations if you can stomach
but how on earth could they be a lesser of all evils in this situation? Like,
because they're not occupying us.
Worse than that?
Because they're
in terms of available allies of the US, who is worse than that at this moment? The United Kingdom is not worse than that, given that they are not occupying the US in any way. The Netherlands is not worse than that.
The traitors within our system who are actively working to undermine, traditional American values and traditional American way of life.
But who?
I wouldn't. Who would that be? It's a combination. It's a combination of
state again, or what?
Well, it's not just the deep state, although they play a part in it. It's a combination of wealthy business elites who run banks and larger corporations. It's a combination of people who, on the ground, sort of support this network unwittingly, like people in the DNC, be they far left or even the moderate leftists who talk about things like mass immigration and open borders, like the people who talk about abolishing ICE, which is absolutely ridiculous. And so, it's a whole network of things.
It's funny because these people are more patriots to America than the GOP at the moment.
No, they're not. They're not.
So many of these talking points. Hold on.
They're not
push for funding for a more secure voting system, and the GOP scum and traitors who should all be executed.
What more secure voting system are you even talking about?
Electronic.
Wait, can I roll this back slightly? We wouldn't even be having a conversation about abolish ICE or any of these other things you just listed if it weren't for the fact that Donald Trump were elected in the first place.
Yep. You're right. He's brought these issues to the forefront, which is great because they should be issues brought to the forefront.
How is that great? You've essentially radicalized people who were not previously radical.
Well, they should be radical because these issues are pertinent to the sanctity of the United States.
No, I'm talking about the left in this case. The people who on the left who are calling for the abolition of ICE would not be calling for the abolition of ICE if you hadn't put Donald Trump as the president.
Well, what Donald Trump has forced them to do is, they used to be much better at incrementalism, where they'd institute these things step by step by step. And I imagine at some point they would certainly get to the abolition of ICE, but Trump has forced their hand. And I think that's a great thing.
Because he did a bad policy, which he later fucking backpedaled on, which is the separation of families. That wasn't an issue under Obama. He should, because it wasn't an issue under Obama. He didn't separate the families. If you're going, you're all going.
Well, it doesn't matter. I think it's still a good deterrent.
Trump, due to his own incompetence in policy, eventually backpedaled on an issue that gave him strife. He made these people against ICE, which is a good body to have.
Well, I don't disagree that he backpedaled. I just wish he shouldn't have.
Also, a key difference between Obama and Trump on this issue is a perverse incentive difference.
I don't care about Obama in this context. Like, I didn't bring up Obama.
No, but hold on. In the case of Obama, what he ended up doing was he actually went with the perverse incentive for quite a long time, until near the end of his presidency, he realized, wait a second, maybe we need to actually abolish the private prison system, which is incentivizing people to just arrest people for the sake of the profit motive. Right? So he abolishes this, and what does Donald Trump do within the first week of taking back office? Reinstates the exact same thing.
Okay, well, how is that related to ICE? I'm not quite getting it.
These things are interconnected because law-abiding, quote, illegal migrants get sent to these places as well. So when you institute a for-profit prison system, you're essentially incentivizing the companies that lobby for law enforcement to push politicians who make things like zero tolerance policy and like just arbitrary search and arrest of everything and so on. And so you end up with more people being jailed than otherwise should have been jailed, and you end up with basically just people making money hand over fist. What is that about? Who looks at that and thinks that's really a good idea? I think that's a great use of time and money.
Well, I think the policy of let's deter these people from actually getting involved in the border came first, and then Trump figured, well, maybe people can make some money on this, and maybe it'll be good for the economy along with being good for border control. So
okay.
I can't claim to know the man's thought process.
So here's another thing. Okay, so here's another thought as well then. In terms of, I see in the chat someone is claiming that they would like to use death squads to hunt down illegals, which is obviously ridiculous. But in terms of that question, since it has been brought up, in fact, Mr. Rightful King of Finland, writing in the chat, there are already death squads in existence. They're in Latin America, and many of them were in fact created by your country. And that is actually part of the reason why there is a refugee crisis out of Central America in the first place. The ones in Guatemala, the ones that were in El Salvador, the ones that were in Honduras.
Are you talking about all the right-wing groups we funded to stop communists popping up?
To quote-unquote stop communism, which is precisely not what was actually occurring. But yeah,
they all went communist because we didn't do a good enough job, so it's not like it wasn't happening.
Those guys. And so what we're talking about is these squads which were not rolled up afterwards and actually became gangs. So for example, when people walk around talking about MS-13 and M4 that and all of the rest of it, these people are actually people who received training, many of them who are essentially just passing it down to like the third generation now, of training that was originally handed out by the United States in the first place. So did you guys not clean up? So you guys did not clean up your own mess, and now it has resulted in a gigantic refugee crisis that's flowing into your country, and then you act as though it's not actually your fault, and that instead you should actually inflict more violence on the people you have already terrorized?
Okay, first and foremost, providing a country a defense from communism is not terrorizing them. And second off, I don't think that it's our responsibility to clean up this supposed mess because
it's literally in your region.
It is like in our region.
The Americas, you created the Monroe Doctrine and actually made sure that the European powers could not just prance around in the region doing it their own way. So you essentially forced everyone to recognize that you're the only person that's allowed to intervene in that region, and then you proceed
we have to.
And then you proceed to blame everyone else for your lack of taking care of the problems you created. Isn't that strange?
Well, I don't think that the problems we've quote-unquote created are problems that you could claim were exacerbated by us, but are by no means are problems that we founded.
Indeed, some of these problems are endemic and already existed before you actually showed up. But if you show up and look between two sides, for example, on the one hand, semi-feudal landlords, and on the other hand, peasants who are seeking justice, and you say, okay, I'm going to side with semi-feudal landlords on purpose and then support death squads, which then creates an ongoing snowball of ridiculousness that leads to a refugee crisis about 40 years later, you can't then wash your hands of it and say, I don't know why these migrants are showing up at my border.
No. I'm sure the Catalonian revolutionaries who were executing farmers who didn't collectivize and priests thought that they were just seeking justice as well, as I'm sure
to be fair, don't interrupt me. Let me actually respond to that, because there's always that priest argument. No, that priest argument is not true either. The priest argument is not true, not because that probably didn't happen, but rather because it happened on the other side also. Some of these right-wing death squads that you all funded actually made their first target nuns that were on the side of social justice. So they were not averse to killing Catholics in order to make sure that the United States was able to win.
No, but they did not go about killing Catholics for the sake of being Catholic, like the Catalonian revolutionaries did. They went out and killed them because they happened to be socialists. And Franco was, he was pretty good friends with JP too. And that was for a reason, because he did end up supporting the Catholic Church. He just had to get rid of them, those that were supporting the other side. And, again, not that that's a good thing, but in war, it happens. And unlike Catalonia, who was deliberately executing people simply for being religious clergymen.
Let's say these things happen. But if you say
the United States wouldn't have had the support what you call the landlord class in Central and Latin America if the Soviets weren't infiltrating and backing these so-called peasant movements in these countries.
Because there were actually contra groups that were from the peasants as well. So you could have supported peasants against other peasants, but for some reason, I guess the US found it easier to not even bother having that conflict.
You're talking about a vast minority, though. Like, a vast minority isn't going to win a war.
It's a matter of strategy.
Yeah, exactly.
And you can't predict what's going to happen in the future.
Okay. Let's say that you all are correct. Hypothetically, it's still your creation. So then you can't come back afterwards now and be like, it's unintended or intended. You can't then come back afterwards and say, I can't figure out why these migrants are coming at our borders. You know exactly why.
Well, that doesn't mean we have to let them in. Why should we let them in just because we tried to fix their fucked up countries?
It doesn't mean that you need to fix. It doesn't mean that you need to fix what you broke then, and not come to everyone else complaining as though we somehow did it to you.
No, I'm not complaining that they did it to us. I'm just saying that
I mean, you and I both agree overpopulation's a bad thing, right? But letting in a flood of immigrants in this manner actually grows the population. You are aware that there are at least 15 million illegal immigrants in the United States, right? So
Thought it
why
was
would you
11
want that
million, but
number?
close enough.
Because if you support abortion on the basis that overpopulation is bad, why would you support illegal immigration when it does the same thing outlawing abortion does?
Yeah, well, I'm not actually in favor of illegal immigration. What I'm in favor of is not destabilizing your own supposed backyard and then ending up with that situation in which you're inflicting further persecution onto people whose countries you are not actually taking responsibility for, even though you are the one who intervened in them.
This was a case where, obviously, we intervened. We made, in some cases, a problem worse that already existed.
And also,
But-
don't think that I'm singling just you out, because I see in the chat people are going to ask me about Mexico. Mexico is also equally bad on this precise issue, because Mexico does the same thing, where Mexico will sometimes covertly be involved in all kinds of ridiculous oligarch behavior, and then when migrants show up inside Mexico, Mexico actually deports something like 70% of people who actually enter Mexico. So they're just as bad.
Well, no, my
They
point
still
was,
deport them. So they are full participants in this nonsense, yet they pretend they are not, and then they turn around and deport people. So I'm not cutting Mexico slack on this issue either.
no, I wouldn't. I wasn't going to claim that. What I was going to say is rather that in this sort of situation, even if we did need to quote unquote take responsibility for it, it would not behoove us to take these people in an action of taking responsibility. And so I still wouldn't find anything wrong with Trump's policy, because it's just, it's a deterrence that's necessary. These people need to stay in their own countries in order to truly fix them. It's not going to be fixed by letting them come and stay here.
Because
Also, I see the chat is asking.
An argument can be made it causes a brain drain when you try.
Yes, it does, but that's why you don't destabilize the place in the first place. And also, I see the chat is asking
Soviets were
me.
the one trying to destabilize Latin America. I hope you realize that.
Okay, let me phrase it a different way then. Let's say that you say that the Soviets destabilized and you restabilized it. You didn't restabilize it very well, though.
Okay, but that's not necessary.
Well,
That's not really our fault, is it?
Well, it kind of is if you declare the Monroe Doctrine, meaning that other European nations are not allowed to do that job for you.
So your claim is that the European powers would have stabilized the
you all are the ones.
better.
You all are the ones that kicked Spain and Portugal out of that region, right?
Well, no. Mexico had a revolution. Brazil had a revolution. Everywhere in the Americas had a revolution. We just said, yeah, we're down with that idea because we had our own revolution.
And there you go then. So it became your responsibility as a consequence of this.
No,
if you're the only person
who's responsible for itself, just because we agree with the idea of independent governance doesn't mean that these nations that become independent are now our responsibility.
It is if you are in there doing things. You can't then wash your hands and pretend you don't know what's happening.
The Monroe Doctrine occurred in the 1800s, and you're conferring action.
And it continued on from there forward because no one has undone it yet.
Yeah, but you're implying that the actions taken by people like Reagan are a direct result of something like the Monroe Doctrine because, we decided nobody else can intervene. So when we try to restabilize a country that the Soviets destabilized, now that means it's our mess because we said, other nations, shouldn't be dicks about it. Like, yeah. I'm not...
Also, I see in the chat people are claiming that they don't buy the death squads lead to illegals argument because the illegals are 2 decades late. 2 decades late from what? The death squads came first, and then afterwards, the death squads became the gangs which people are now upset about.
No, I don't. I'm not making an argument.
Are they expecting that was going to happen instantly, or do you think that's going to happen over the course of a generation, and then the civil society implodes?
No, I believe in that. My trouble is just that this idea that because countries went to shit and we tried to fix it, that, all of a sudden we have to take a responsibility for when our good intentions, don't work as well as we wanted them to, even though we were doing a good thing in the process.
I wouldn't go as far as to say there were good intentions either, because I find it very difficult to believe the good intentions behind the stuff that happened in Guatemala, for example.
Well,
which person looks at that objectively and thinks that was an architect of some kind of good intention going on there?
I have to look more into the Guatemala situation, as I'm not fully aware. But okay,
I mean, it could just be that I have a bias against landlords controlling everything. So there is that.
there is that chance as well.
But I also have a bias towards the Soviet Union, so I tend to side with whoever is opposed to the Soviet Union. That's what the Cold War was all about. It was about maintaining a balance of power, an equilibrium between the Soviets and the Americans. And that's
But
exactly
are you entirely surprised?
We didn't also just back these right-wing death squads or these right-wing dictatorships. We also backed Mao, something you defend. One of Henry Kissinger's greatest achievements.
So then, by the same logic,
outside of the US.
So then, by the same logic, if you're in Latin America doing operations, why would you choose, if you had to choose a specific way of doing this, why would you choose to put yourself in the worst position possible by backing right-wing landlords and death squads, which everyone hates, and then act surprised that all of the peasantry hold on, and then act surprised that all of the peasantry decide they want to be with the Soviet Union instead?
Well, no, the Soviet Union came first. You have the causation backwards.
No, wait. Why don't you ask Mao? Because Mao backed right-wing movements in Africa. I hope you realize this.
He did not back semi-feudal organizations.
He did back a right-wing Christian organization.
And also, in cases
along with Reagan.
And also, in cases where they did actually enter in with the US and they ended up doing stuff like what you just described, which is the Christian blah blah dictatorship thing, in such a case, again, you should not be surprised that then peasants align themselves to the Soviet Union to escape from that ridiculousness. So, in other words, what I'm arguing here is that the best way to prevent the Soviet Union from gaining a base of support among the peasantry is to operate among the peasantry so the Soviet Union cannot gain a base of support there. You don't come in from the top and say, okay, the peasants have a chance of moving into being supportive of the Soviet Union, so you're going to support right-wing death squads and landlords? That's just almost guaranteeing that you're going to have a Soviet problem.
Well, again, I think the Soviet problem came first, and our attempted solutions came afterwards.
Yes, of course it came first. And if your attempted solution comes afterwards, if your attempted solution is to shoot everyone who may or may not be aligned to the Soviet Union, that's not actually helping the situation. That's just going to make them double down.
That wasn't the whole solution.
That's going to make them double down. Obviously, it's not the whole solution, but you understand where I'm going in broad strokes, which is that if you come into a situation...
Well, that's the thing. The strokes are too broad.
How is it too broad? If you come into a situation and you see peasants have a high likelihood of going over to the Soviet Union in order to try to seek justice, if you come into the situation and say, okay, therefore we are against peasants, that's not going to bring them over to your side. That's going to lock them into that position.
Well, no, you have, in some respects, obviously, if you join the people who you are opposing, but at the same time, winning over the peasants was never an option because the communists are promising some sort of utopia where they control the means of production. Like, what are we going to tell them that's better than that? What's our narrative? We have to ally with the people who we know we are going. We have to ally with the people who we know are going to win.
You have to ally with the people who resemble your ideology the
most. I would hope that semi-feudal landlords don't resemble your ideology the most. This is the thing where you end up with very bad public relations as a consequence of that. Instead of entering in and saying, okay, the Soviets are lying to you peasants because we have a different way of doing this, which is actually better. Right?
Well, then
instead of entering in and doing that, instead of entering in and doing that, you guys entered in instead and we're like, well, actually, we kind of think that semi-feudal landlords resemble us in some way, so let's ally with them. And then you're surprised to find that they regard you as being allied with semi-feudalists. They shouldn't be surprised then.
Who won the Cold War? That's all I have to say.
Okay, and you won it, but you won it in a way that was quite messy because of that. At least in the Latin American context, I can't speak for everywhere else, but in the Latin American context, it was won in a way that was quite unnecessarily messy, which has now resulted in backlashes, which have backlashed to the point of 2018 when you have a bunch of people on your border looking you in the face now.
Okay.
And so, I mean, you could have won it in a different way. That's the only argument I'm making here. I don't see why that is so controversial.
Well,
I think we can discuss this in part 4, honestly. It's kind of funny, though, how we spent like 2 hours getting on Pragmatic's back. Now me and Pragmatic are siding with you against you on the Cold War. That's a very interesting turn of events. But no offense against you, Ray.
Yeah, it's just on the Latin America thing. I am different on that issue because of the fact that the United States, even in terms of like holding down groups that they shouldn't have held down and promoting groups they shouldn't have promoted. In cases where they did actually get it right, they then undid it. So, for example, there are plenty of countries in Latin America that are not the ones that I mentioned earlier, such as Nicaragua and places like this, where they actually were able to find a group that was not aligned to the Soviet Union, but which was promising some kind of social justice narrative that people could get behind. And what happened in those cases? The United States got greedy and avaricious once again and decided, no, we don't want to have a compromise with a kind of, I don't know if you want to call it a center-left style dictatorship, which is aligned to the United States. We don't want to have that kind of compromise. Instead, we're going to remove these individuals. And so the war in Nicaragua, for example, ended up happening where, what's his name? His name suddenly has evaded me, was removed and extradited to the United States or whatever, and then they put him in the jail because they said that he was trafficking cocaine or something. You know the person I'm referring to?
No, but I think we can end on the one piece. I think we can end on the one piece of agreement that U.S. foreign policy decidedly sucks.
No, but I wasn't finished the point though. The point is that when you have situations like that one as well, it means that even in the cases where you accidentally did get it right, they then turn around and undid it, and thus, in the process of undoing it, made it appear that the United States was an unreliable ally because of the fact that they will always stick you in the back at the end of it. Kind of like what happened with Saddam Hussein as well, where Saddam Hussein was effectively not antagonistic to the United States for a large portion of the Cold War, and then they stuck him in the back. This is not good for public relations because it means that even people who do want to serve their people while simultaneously being allied to you will always have to be cautious of the fact that there's going to be a knife somewhere coming, maybe.
If that's still, I want to end this. I want to get my final say on something real quickly. Besides, I'm sorry, just one last thing.
It's okay.
If Nasik was here for me to say this, he would be triggered since he's a huge supporter of the Iraq War. Besides the Iraq War, which I now oppose, because I saw Saddam Hussein as a asset, a necessary evil, so to speak, to counter Iranian influence in the region. But I guess we can't go back in time, I suppose. But yeah, I generally support American foreign policy, but I do agree with you that there are some things we need. I agree with both of you that there are some things we need to take responsibility for. Like Iraq was a complete disaster, in my opinion. It was a complete and fucking disaster.
All right, Iraq is a disaster. American foreign policy is a joke. And
I also want to address one more question that's in the chat as well, which should only take about 1 minute to address. I've been asked if I have any actual proof that the death squads in Latin America turned into gangs. Council on Foreign Relations has an article on it recently in light of the events that have been occurring. So I'll provide a link to that somewhere.
Yeah,
and it'll probably end up in the thing.
The Council on Foreign Relations is generally a pretty good source on foreign policy stuff.
Exactly.
Okay. Foreign policy, good sources. 3 hour stream. It's 1:10 in the morning for me.
Same. It's 12 here.
Good night, everybody.